Missa inte Green Friday på cdon.com. Vi fortsätter hela helgen.
Hi everyone, welcome to my macroeconomic series of videos. Another major macroeconomic objective of governments is for balanced trade. Not to have unbalanced trade, either a massive surplus in trade or a massive deficit in trade. We need to develop that further and how we can actually measure trade performance. When we consider trade really, we go to the balance of payments. And within the balance of payments, there are three accounts of international transactions, of money leaving the country and money entering the country. In truth, money can leave and money can enter the country through a whole host of various reasons. There can be massive financial reasons, financial types of transactions, which the capital account and the financial account of the balance of payments measure. We're not going to worry about those. We're going to focus on the current account. So within the balance of payments, there are these three major accounts. And all these accounts measure are the flows, the amount of money entering the country and the amount of money leaving the country. The current account is the one we look at when we are trying to measure trade. And at AS level, that's the one that we focus purely on. We don't worry about these two until later. So, the current account of the balance of payments consists of four different sections. You need to know all four. The top two are the most important, because they're the ones that relate to trade. So, the current account measures, number one, the trade in goods. So, exports and imports of goods. It also measures trade in services. Exports and imports of services. Together, this is known as the trade balance for a country. So when we talk about the balance of trade, when we talk about the trade performance, we're isolating these two things. But importantly, all students forget this, it's crazy. There are two other parts of the account as well, right? So when we talk about the current account improving, it doesn't just have to be these two things, there are two other parts of it as well. Albeit these two are minor, they're much smaller in comparison to these. But that's important. Yeah. So, you've also got the income part of the account.
Yeah.
And you have transfers.
I guess I'll go away.
So, whilst these two measure the export and imports of goods and services, we have the income part of the account, which measures flows of income, income entering the country or income leaving the country. So remittances are a good example of this. So when, let's say, a UK worker goes abroad and works abroad and earns income, if he then brings that income back to the UK, that's going to be a positive on the current account. Transfers can be government transfers, so the payment of EU fees, so paying fees to the EU. It could be the contribution of aid, so the government paying aid to Sub-Saharan Africa, to India, to developing countries. That's money leaving the country, so that would be a negative on the current account. So, what's measured here is not quantity. It is not quantity, it's not quantity, it's not quantity, it's not quantity. We're not measuring the volume here. We're measuring the value. The value, alright? We're looking at money flows. It's an account, right? It's an account. So we're measuring financial flows, money flows. Money is important here, not volume, alright? Value, not volume with current account. So here, when we're talking about trading goods and trading services, we're looking at how much money are we spending on imports and how much money are we generating from export revenue, alright? And for income, how much money is leaving the country in terms of income, how much money is entering the country in terms of income. So that's the key thing that we're measuring. And when we look at the money flows, the overall money flows, these four sections will either be a net positive or a net negative. So, our trading goods, let's say that in the UK, which is true, we are importing much more than we export. So the money we spend on imports, the money leaving the country, is more than the money entering the country when it comes from trading goods. Well, in that sense, our trading goods balance is going to be negative. For trading services, we export. More money is entering the country from the export of services than money leaving the country through the import of services. So for the UK, that's positive.
Okay, boss.
For income in the UK, more money is entering the country than money leaving the country via income. So that's positive. And for transfers in the UK, more money is leaving the country than is entering the country via transfers, so that's negative. In the UK, that's a huge negative. So overall, you add up all of these numbers, and then you work out whether you have a current account deficit or whether you have a current account surplus. If your overall figure is negative, you have a deficit. So overall,
crazy move.
if you have a negative, that means you have a current account. If overall your figure is positive, like it is in Germany, Germany and other countries, off the top of my head I can't really remember at the moment, it keeps changing. But yeah, overall if it's positive, you're going to have a current account surplus. Okay? In the UK it's negative, these added together you get a negative number, so you have a deficit. But bear that in mind, okay? It's all about money flows, it's not about volume, it's about value. So the value of all of these things is added up, and then we work out whether we're in deficit or we're in surplus. And remember, it doesn't just have to be because of trade in goods and services. There could be other reasons why there is a current account deficit and a current account surplus. I hope that helps you understand the balance of payments and especially the current account. See you next time. Thank you.
Hey man.
65B.
Hello man.
Right. Our country's got a current account deficit. Should we care? Well, to answer that question, we need to understand, one, how has it been caused? And then we need to understand what are the consequences of it actually occurring. When you look at the UK's had a current account deficit for like 30 years. The US has had a current account deficit for donkey years as well. It doesn't really look like the government cares that much about it. Why? Well, let's understand. Why might a current account deficit be caused? Right, we could have demand side reasons, we could have supply side reasons. Now we know the current account has got 4 sections to it. When we talk about deficits and surpluses, we tend to focus on trading goods and trading services. We focus on those two things. So, demand side
damn it.
reasons.
I thought I had it.
There might be strong domestic
I can't
growth.
really hear you guys because I'm studying in the background.
What?
I can't hear you because
That
I
might be a
have
reason
my
why. There might be a recession
courses in the
disease,
background. I'm studying while playing.
and
Okay.
a country might have
I can
a
hear
strong
like 50% of what
exchange
you're
rate.
saying. I posted my stream link
Let's explain all
down.
these things and why the demand
Please
side
like,
factors.
share, and
So
subscribe.
these all come from the demand side of the economy. So
I go do
if there is strong domestic growth in the economy,
okay?
it means that
Hey.
incomes are high, it means living standards are high, it means people are more willing to buy now imports.
Hey.
Because incomes are high, they're richer, they want to improve their material standards of living, and basically they want more stuff. And a lot of that stuff is not necessarily going to be made in the domestic economy. A lot of that stuff needs to be imported.
One
to
amen.
be made. So that's likely to increase imports, and as imports increase, the amount of money leaving the country increases, worsening the current account position, potentially causing a deficit. If there is a recession overseas, it means incomes abroad are falling, so the demand for our exports is going to reduce. If the demand for exports fall, well that means the money generated, the revenue generated from exports is going to decrease. Again, worsening our current account,
I'm coming.
maybe causing a deficit. And if there's a strong exchange rate, right, strong exchange rate, right, that means imports are going to be cheaper and exports are going to be more expensive. I'm going to write this down now, and another video I'll explain this. So just think to yourself, right, spiced. If you want to understand what that means, watch my video on exchange rates to understand. I'll talk about the easiest way to understand exchange rates.
Nice.
So yeah, spiced. Strong pound or strong currency makes imports cheap and exports dear. Dear just means expensive. So if exports are expensive, we're probably not going to export very much. And if that happens, the revenue we get from exports, the amount of money brought in, reduces. At the same time, imports are really cheap. So we might import more, in which case the money we spend on leaving the country on imports actually increases, which then again makes our current account position worse. So 3 demand side reasons. There are also supply side reasons which might cause it.
That's
So
what
supply side reasons are all about basically the relative cost of our exports.
Come on, guys.
And how they're not really going to be competitive. And that might be because of low investment. That might be because of low productivity. It might be because of high relative inflation.
Nej. Är du det?
Ja. Jag ser det.
Åh, jo
high
men.
unit labour costs.
Kosomak.
One garage, guys.
It might be because of poor quality
Two garage.
of goods made. Maybe reliability as well. So poor quality.
Oh, very
poor
beautiful spray.
Or it might be something as simple as a depletion.
We
of
got
resources.
this in the bag. Blue, what rank are you?
I am A plus in
So
ESEA,
numbers
but
1,
now I'm marking
2,
account
3,
to global and then I'm
4,
selling it.
especially 5 kind of, are all to do with the lack of competitiveness of domestic exports.
Yeah.
So all of these
It's
things,
nice if
here,
you
the
don't-
first 4 especially,
Because I
make our exports less
Great, thank
competitive
you.
to other countries.
Oh,
In which
shopping.
case, foreigners would rather buy from
It
other
was a
countries.
mistake.
So these are all supply
That's a
side
very
reasons.
big
Supply
step,
side because it's all about the price, all about the competitiveness of our export.
Except
Number
aiming
6 is
almost.
very simple. This one applied to the UK actually. The UK was a big exporter of North Sea oil. When that oil reserve, when the oil actually depleted, when it reduced, it meant our exports fell. So if we are exporting a resource and we're very dependent on it, if that resource is depleted, our exports are going to reduce. We're going to lose revenue from exports. So these are all supply side reasons as well, which you need to understand. Pretty much all of these apply to the UK, which is quite terrible for the UK really. And to be honest with you, if you're evaluating, supply side reasons are much more destructive than demand side reasons because these can be long term. That kind of answers the question as to why the UK has had such a deficit for such a long time. Mainly because it's been caused by supply side factors and they are long term.
Hallå, är du pro-player eller?
Very hard to
I
rectify.
used to play
You can't just change
professionally, not
productivity
anymore.
overnight. You can't
Okay.
change your unit labour costs overnight. These things are very hard to change. So bear that in mind.
You
And
are
what are the
very
consequences?
game.
So what are the problems with
I played it
account
for
deficit,
14
if there are
years.
any?
You expect.
Oh, 40.
Well, the main
Dude.
problem,
That's longer than I
the
have
main
lived.
problem is picture in your head. Aggregate demand, the equation, aggregate demand. If X minus M in aggregate demand, the end of the aggregate demand equation, if that's falling,
Can you
aggregate
never
demand is going to
smoke?
fall. So why is that bad for
Again?
an economy?
Thank you.
Well,
Oh,
there's
no,
the
not
equation. So AD
Yeah, because I'm trying to snipe
is
here
C
while
plus
you
I plus
Shot
G
me,
plus
shot me.
No,
X
don't.
minus M. What we're saying
Okay.
is if there is a current account deficit, then this bracket must be negative. And if that's negative, AD
Oh, there will be.
therefore must be
I need
falling. So on a
Come with
diagram,
me.
what's going on? Well, there's our aggregate supply. Aggregate demand, therefore, is
Oh,
shifting to the left. And what does that do? Well, that leads to a reduction in growth, doesn't it? And that's not a good thing. Yes, okay, we might see some benefit from a reduction in demand pull inflation. But really, this consequence, this negative, outweighs any other benefits, really. A reduction in growth and at the same time an increase in unemployment. There is now less need for labour, there's less demand for labour, there's less demand for goods and services. So unemployment is likely to pick up as well. So reduction in growth and increase in unemployment, this is not good. AD shifts to the left as a result of X minus M decreasing as a result of a current account deficit. That's the major consequence there. But really, you can evaluate that. You can say, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, but it depends on the size of the deficit. If the deficit as a percentage of GDP is really small, then who cares? And that's what the UK governments and the US governments have argued, that their deficits are only a small percentage of GDP. So really, they don't have this much of an effect. Yeah, they might reduce aggregate demand, but they would say they reduce aggregate demand, I don't know, by maybe
And four?
this much. Tiny, tiny,
You're
tiny.
what told me this
It's
time.
not having much of an impact on the economy at
Oh,
all.
middle.
So who cares? Why should we be worried about it? Their argument. At the same time, our current account deficit might be an indicator of a strong growing economy. If it's caused by the
I mean,
demand
more
side
man's in
because
me.
of strong growth, then surely that's a good thing. That's a good consequence, actually, one might argue. So you can evaluate it that
Shot
way.
me.
But you can also evaluate it and say,
Why don't
well,
you
it
rotate?
really depends
Why don't you
on
rotate?
where it's been
Okay, I wrote
caused.
it.
Is it a demand side factor or a supply side factor that cause
No,
it?
I look with, I look
Demand
with.
side factors we're not so worried about. Supply side factors can be deadly. They can be long term.
Rotate
So
orange.
that's another way you can evaluate it as well.
But
Alright?
there's one okay.
So bear that in mind. Another way to evaluate, well, we're assuming
I'll
that
see
it's
it.
going to be the trading goods and trading
Oh, that's
services parts of the account
Yeah, go,
that
yeah,
are
go.
causing the deficit. What if it's income? What if it's transfers that are pushing the
Oh,
current
yeah,
account
there,
deficit?
I think it's
That's
good.
another way to evaluate.
I
Maybe
got-
it's
yeah.
not
Okay.
on
Smokes.
trading goods and trading services. Okay, so bear all that in mind. It's something that confuses a lot of students, but actually it's dead easy and quite fun actually when you get your head around it. Hope that helps. See you all next time. Thank you.
I hold me next round.
Missa inte Green Friday på cdon.com. Vi fortsätter hela helgen.
We talk about trade occurring as if it must always be good, without really understanding what the true benefits of trade actually are. So, let's have a look and see what the benefits of trade are specifically to firms and to consumers, but also what some of the problems of trade are and why some countries adopt protectionist
I hold
measures.
me.
So, firms benefit from free trade a lot. The reason is because firms then are allowed to specialise. They don't have to worry about producing lots of different goods and services. They can specialise in producing goods that they are very good at producing, knowing that they can import goods or raw materials that they can't produce or that they're not good at producing. That means that overall welfare can increase. It means for them they can increase profits and revenues. They can really focus on stuff that they're very good at producing, which is also good for consumers. So number one is good for firms and it's good for consumers. Specialisation gains. They can produce goods at lower cost. They can increase revenues and imports.
Don't rotate to me. I got it.
It allows them access to larger markets, which allows them to increase their sales potential, increase their revenue potential, accessing markets that would be closed otherwise. At the same time, it also allows them to buy raw materials at lower cost, because now they've got a much bigger choice. They've got access to all these different countries and different markets that they didn't have before. So they can also buy raw materials at lower cost. They can increase their growth rate of technology much faster now, with more kind of goods and services being produced, more different techniques that are out there for firms to copy and to have access to. They can advance that technology much faster than they would have been able to do before.
Come Orange, come here.
Consumers are also huge benefits.
Orange, come.
Because of greater competition that now exists, you're competing with worldwide markets.
Yes.
Consumers are going to benefit from higher quality and lower prices. These two have to exist now. Because of the great competition that exists, domestic firms can't get away, or just generally firms can't get away with high prices and low quality, intense competition. And similarly, there'll be a much greater choice available. You'll have lots of different countries that produce similar goods and services, like TVs, but because lots of different countries are doing it, there are going to be all sorts of different TVs made out there, different products made out there, different selling points, different kind of types of goods produced, which is all to the benefit of the consumer. Choice increases. But there are some problems with trade as well. You'll have lots of different countries that will produce similar goods and services, like TVs, but because lots of different countries are doing it, there are going to be all sorts of different TVs made out there, different products made out there, different selling points, different kind of types of goods produced, which is all to the benefit of the consumer. Choice increases. But there are some problems with trade as well. Trade, through people specialising, firms specialising, countries specialising. If specialisation keeps changing from one period of time to the other, it might lead to fluctuations in the size of industries. It might lead to some industries at one stage booming, but then through a change in specialisation, or through a loss of advantage from specialisation, it might lead to then an industry actually contracting. So declining and contracting, declining and booming industries in that kind of pattern can actually be quite destabilizing. It could lead to suddenly labour being made redundant or labour not being needed to then suddenly labour being needed. In which case, if you have occupational immobility of labour issues, it might not be easy to suddenly expand your labour force or to decrease your labour force if you need to. So that's one problem. At the same time, it might just lead to a massive decline of industries. So you might have decided as a country or as a firm to specialise heavily in the production of something. But if after a period of time, another country or another firm can do better than you, and can beat you basically, what's going to happen to that industry? That industry is going to collapse, and that's exactly what happened in the UK as China basically increased their hold on the manufacturing sector. The UK, who specialised in the production of manufactured goods, just lost out, and the whole industry just collapsed. So that's one major issue. As a result, some governments look to protect domestic industries, adopting protectionist measures, reducing free trade, reducing international trade.
Verbal.
As a result.
Go back.
And what different ways can governments protect their domestic industries? Well, there are a huge range of different policies that could be used. They could impose tariffs, quotas,
I got one tap. One with the garage.
embargoes. Oh, spelled that really wrong. Embargoes. They might give subsidies to domestic firms. They might issue more red tape. They might engage in voluntary exchange restraints. So all these protectionist measures try to do is to protect the domestic industries, to protect maybe infant industries in their domestic economy. So tariffs are just a tax on imports, a tax on any kind of goods that will be imported, any kind of goods in competition with domestic firms. Put taxes on those imports, which will then promote the production of domestic goods instead. Quotas are just limitations on how much can be imported from abroad. So put limits on imports. Maybe just ban imports, that's very extreme, or embargoes, that is bans. Just ban imports. Maybe subsidise local producers instead, reduce their cost of production, which might reduce prices, which might make domestic firms more competitive. Maybe make red tape, increase red tape on imports, make it harder for people to import certain goods from foreign countries. Increase red tape, administration barriers is what red tape is all about. Or maybe engage in voluntary exchange restrictions. The problem with engaging in tariffs and engaging in any of these protectionist measures really is that you can expect retaliation. I mean, if you put a tax on imports from a country, from Australia or somewhere, the Australian government's not going to be happy at all, are they? They're likely going to retaliate and maybe put a tax on your goods instead. So that's not necessarily a good thing. So if you engage in a voluntary exchange restraint, then together, as two governments, you can kind of agree on certain quotas, so you can agree on certain tariffs, in which case you're not going to suffer from extreme retaliation if you actually engage in any of these protectionist measures. So voluntary exchange restraint, for example, might be one country agreeing on a quota on imports from a given country, and then in return, that country agrees on a quota on the imports on whatever the other country is selling. So in that sense, there is a voluntary restraint from both countries, which is an extreme protection, but still a smaller form of protectionism, which then negates the chance of retaliation as a result.
I'm not gonna drop you, so
hope that helps. See you next time. Thank you.
Jag köper begagnat. Jag kör ju skiten ur en cykel på 3-4 månader.
Exchange rates, a very simple topic, but a topic that a lot of students find very difficult for reasons I just never understand. The exchange rate, very simply, is just the price of one currency in another currency. It's just a price. For example, £1 might be equal to $1.60. The price of £1 in terms of dollars is $1.60. The price of one currency in another currency. Simple as that. And because we're talking about the price of something, when we try to understand where that price comes from, where an exchange rate is determined, we simply go to an economic market. Demand and supply, the force of demand and supply, tell us where this price comes from. So here, we're looking at the price of pounds, aren't we? We're looking at the pound exchange rate against the dollar. On the y-axis, we can't just write price. Specifically, it's the price of the pound in dollars. That's very important. So anytime in an exam situation, they've told you what exchange rate you're determining, in what currency, then you have to use those currencies on the y-axis. The price of whatever currency you're trying to work out, the exchange rate you're trying to work out, in the currency that they're giving you. And on the x-axis, quantity of the currency, you have the market for. So in this case, quantity of the pound. We're working out the pound exchange rate. So, when working out
I got me, go B.
the exchange rate of the pound in dollars, we have a demand for the pound and a supply of the pound, and where the two intersect we have equilibrium. That gives us a price and the quantity, and the price is very simply the exchange rate, which in this case is £1 equals £1. That's it. So this is the market for the pound. A market for pounds, not random demand and supply. Very specific demand and supply of the pound for the pound. That's it. That's how an exchange rate is determined. The force of demand and supply, where the two intersect, we have equilibrium, that gives you the exchange rate, the price of the currency you're trying to work with. Don't get confused by that, make sure it's crystal clear in your head now. Thanks for watching, see you next time.
Just nu pågår Green Friday. Vårens största shoppingdag fortsätter hela helgen på cdon.com med riktigt schyssta priser på skönhet, mobiler,
Right, now having understood how an exchange rate is determined, the next question is understanding how an exchange rate can appreciate and how an exchange rate can depreciate. In my previous video, we looked at the price of pound, the pound exchange rate in dollars. I'm going to stick with that example here. So remember, an exchange rate, in this case the pound exchange rate, is determined via the forces of demand and supply. There is a market for a currency. And very simply, when demand and supply in the market change, then you can have a difference in price. The price can increase, exchange rate can appreciate, or the exchange rate can depreciate. So I'm going to stick with the price of pounds in dollars, use that as an example. I'm going to stick with quantity of pounds down below. We're looking at the pound exchange rate here. So let's say initially, equilibrium P1Q1, £1 could buy $1.60. Let's say that was the initial equilibrium price. But for some reason, let's say demand for the pound has increased. Look at the diagram. When demand increases, when it shifts to the right, there's a new price, a higher price form, which means the exchange rate has got stronger. The pound has got stronger. What does that mean? It means the pound can buy more
Last
of
round, what you're trying
the dollar,
to say?
more of another currency. So maybe now the pound can buy $1.80 instead. Means the pound has got stronger. So the next question is, why might demand for the pound increase? On a general level, it means that foreigners are demanding the pound. Foreigners are demanding this currency. There are 5 main reasons why they might do that. One, maybe there's been an increase in relative interest rates. That word relative is important because it means relative to the rest of the world. So in the UK, in this example, interest rates are higher than they are anywhere else in the world. If that's the case, the increase is higher than anywhere else, then foreigners are going to think, well, hang on a minute, maybe now the UK is the best place to put my money. The UK will give me a great rate of return on my savings. So if I put my money in UK banks and UK financial institutions, I'm going to get a very good rate of return. So they do that. And in doing so, they demand the pound. They swap their foreign currency for pounds. And that increases demand for the pound. Shifting it right, increasing the pound, appreciating it. Maybe speculators who are just traders who trade in the foreign exchange markets, if they anticipate a rise in the pound, they're going to think, well, quickly, move my money into pounds. Quickly, let it rise in value and then take it away so I can make a profit. So if they anticipate a rise in the pound, they're going to move their money into pounds, increasing the demand for the pound, causing it to appreciate in value. If there is an increase in foreign direct investment, basically foreign firms enter the UK and set up in the UK, they have to pay for factories in pounds, they have to pay their workers in pounds, they have to pay for machinery in pounds. Everything needs to be done in pounds. So that involves exchanging their currency that they hold for pounds, which increases the demand for the pound, causing it to increase in price, appreciate. The next two are all to do with the price of UK exports and the demand for UK exports. So number 4, if there's a rise in incomes abroad, it means now that foreigners might actually demand UK exports. They've got richer, it means they might want more stuff, and some of that stuff might be produced in the UK, in which case they have to buy in pounds. They can't pay for UK goods in their own currency, they have to pay in pounds. Then that involves them swapping their currency for pounds, increasing demand. In UK goods, UK exports become very competitive, so if there is an increase in international competitiveness, maybe because of a fall in unit labour costs, a fall in inflation, a rise in investment, maybe a rise in productivity, all of which make UK exports more competitive, maybe that will increase the demand for UK exports. And therefore, as more exports are sold, people have to buy in pounds, that increases the demand for the pound. Right, so this market, we're looking at the demand and supply of the pound. So here, demand for the pound has increased for these 5 reasons, causing the currency to appreciate. But similarly, the pound can depreciate, or any currency can depreciate if supply shifts to the right. So, if a currency depreciates, maybe initially, in this case £1 could buy $1.60, but now because it's depreciated, £1 can only buy $1.40, maybe. So when a currency depreciates, it can buy less of another currency. So why might supply shift to the right? Well, when would people want to exchange their pounds for another currency? Because that's what it means if supply increases. People want to swap their pounds for a different currency, exchange their pounds. Well, there has been a fall in interest rates, a fall in relative interest rates. Now all of a sudden, investors that currently have their money in UK banks are thinking, well, the UK is not so good anymore. It's not a great place for me to get a great return on my saving. So they move their money away from the UK, increasing the supply of the pound for another currency. That's just the opposite of this. That's just the opposite of an increase in FDI. So if firms that were originally operating in Britain decide to move away, then all the pounds that they hold are going to be swapped for another currency. And in doing so, that increases the supply of the pound. Similarly, number 4, if there are an increase in incomes abroad, an increase in incomes at home, domestically, if basically people in the UK get richer, they're going to demand more imports. And when we demand and buy more imports, we have to buy in another currency. So if we want to buy goods from the USA, we have to buy in dollars, which involves exchanging the pound, selling the pound for dollars, and that increases supply. So all of these 4 factors here will increase supply, where the pound is exchanged for another currency.
Don't rotate. Wait him to rotate and then go back. Go back.
They exchange their currency for the pound. They're desperate, they demand the pound. And that increases demand, and that causes the currency to appreciate, whereas when supply increases, it causes the currency to depreciate. I hope that now makes sense. You can understand why currencies change. This is very important to know, so learn these very well, and hopefully now you're a master of exchange rate change. See you next time. Thank you very much.
Good job. Nice try, man.
Magnus, jag vill ställa en fråga.
Lägg av, jag har ju sagt att jag inte vill.
Right, so now we need to look at exchange rate impacts. We've done the hard work. We understand when an exchange rate can appreciate, when an exchange rate can depreciate. What impact does it have if an exchange rate gets stronger or if a currency gets weaker? We need to understand the effect on the macroeconomy. You've done the hard work, so why worry? Take it easy, man. Learn these acronyms. Life becomes very simple when we do. So when a currency gets stronger, just think spiced. You shouldn't have to think anymore. You've done the hard work. Take a chill pill. Learn these acronyms. Don't even question it. Life becomes easier when you learn it. When a weak currency, when you're working with a weak currency, just learn this acronym and you'll be absolutely fine. Basically, in macroeconomics, whenever an exchange rate changes, gets stronger, gets weaker, we're looking at the trade performance of the economies very specifically. So let's take a strong currency. We learned spiced. Okay? That tells us exactly what's going to happen now. With a strong pound or with a strong currency, imports become cheaper, exports become dearer. Dearer just means more expensive. That's why spiced is brilliant. It tells us all of that. So then we can isolate the effects on imports and exports.
I'll take an
so
open kill
therefore,
for B. You guys push, okay?
They become cheaper.
Everybody, come on.
So the demand for imports is going to increase, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm coming.
Therefore, the expenditure on imports, the amount of money we spend on imports, is going to increase as well. They're now cheaper.
Push.
At the same time, exports have become dearer, they've become more expensive. So demand for exports is going to fall. And the revenue brought in by exports is going to fall because we're not selling as many. So then we can look at, okay, fine, we know imports and exports. Where does that feature? It features in the aggregate demand equation as X minus M. Export revenue minus import expenditure. So if our import expenditure is going up, that's increasing, and our export revenue is going down, that's decreasing. Overall, the value of this bracket is going to fall, which means that aggregate demand is going to fall because that is a part of the aggregate demand equation. So on a diagram, when there is a strong exchange rate, aggregate demand is going to decrease from AD1 to AD2. It's going to shift to the left, which causes a reduction in growth and a reduction in demand pull, inflationary pressure. And as growth decreases from Y1 to Y2, there is going to be an increase in unemployment.
I don't want you.
And like I said, there's going to be some benefit from a reduction in demand pull inflationary pressure. So that's how you analyse that. The opposite happens for a weak currency. So if a currency depreciates, gets weaker, falls in value, then we go to WIDEC, which is the opposite of spice. So learn these two. WIDEC W is for weak currency or weak pound, makes imports dear, expensive, and exports cheap. So, imports now become expensive. Whereas here, imports were cheap. So if imports are now expensive, the demand for imports is going to decrease, and the money we spend on imports is going to decrease. Whereas for exports, well, exports now become cheaper.
One beside.
Whereas with a strong exchange rate, exports became more expensive. So now, if exports are cheaper with a weak currency, demand for exports is going to increase. The revenue brought in from export sales is likely to increase because we can sell more as a benefit of this lower price. So what's the link now? Well, again, we go to x minus n. We know x minus n is a big feature of the aggregate demand equation. Well, if the revenue brought in from exports is increasing and the money we spend on imports is decreasing, overall, this bracket is going to increase. Therefore, aggregate demand is likely to increase. So on the diagram, you shift aggregate demand to the right from AD1 to AD2, and that increases growth from Y1 to Y2, but there is a consequence of demand pull inflation from P1 to P2.
Everyone, come here.
And because of growth, there's going to be a reduction in unemployment too. So a weak currency, there are big benefits to the macroeconomy from increased growth and decreased unemployment, but there are some negatives from increase in inflation. Whereas with a strong currency, the opposite happens. Reduction in growth and increase in unemployment, but a fall in demand pull inflationary pressure. So that's all well and good. There is also a dual effect going on here. I'm not going to draw this, but it's important for you to understand this. When we look at a weak currency, and in fact a strong currency too,
Leave last one, I will Zeus.
there is another impact going on, and that's the link to imports. Remember, what was one of the causes of cost-push inflationary pressure? Cost-push inflation was caused by any change in the costs of production for firms in the macroeconomy. If the cost of production rises, there is going to be cost-push inflation. Short-run aggregate supply is going to shift to the left. If there is a fall in cost of production, short-run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. There is going to be a fall in cost-push inflation. So here, with a weak currency, imports have become more expensive. Therefore, for firms who import raw materials to produce, their costs of production are going to increase. And they're going to pass on those higher costs via higher prices. So a weak currency, as well as actually increasing demand pull inflation, can also increase cost push inflation too. Very, very important dual effect that all students forget. Whereas for a strong currency, you're going to see a reduction in demand pull inflation because AD shifts to the left, but also you're going to see a reduction in cost push inflation because now imports have become cheaper. So that reduces the cost of production for firms, which means short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right, reducing cost push inflation pressure. So make sure you know that yes, there is a big aggregate demand side link here to both, but there is also an aggregate supply link to both. Right? And one final thing we need to do is to evaluate. So the main link is to aggregate demand. Fine. But whether that happens or not, whether these things happen or not, aggregate demand shifts left or shifts right, depends on lots of factors. So we need to know what these evaluation points are as well. So whenever we're evaluating what happens as a result of an exchange rate change, you can always bring in some of these depends on points. So the end effect on inflation, on growth, and unemployment from an exchange rate change depends on one. The PED for exports and imports. Take spiced, a strong exchange rate. We've assumed that with spiced, imports become cheaper, exports become more expensive, therefore aggregate demand is likely to shift to the left because it's harder for us to export and we import more. Yeah, but what if the PED for imports and exports is really price inelastic? Then maybe demand for exports may decrease, but only by a tiny bit. And maybe demand for imports may increase, but only by a tiny bit. So therefore, maybe net exports won't decrease by very much. Therefore, maybe aggregate demand won't decrease by very much. Right? So that's what you can say. It depends on the PED for imports and exports. We're trying to evaluate how much aggregate demand changes. It also depends on the size of the appreciation or depreciation.
Go A. Go A.
Go A.
Go A. Make as much noise as you can.
Okay. Yes.
Obviously, a very big depreciation, a weak currency, a very much a large change in the value of the currency, a big weakening of the currency, is going to have a much larger impact on the demand for exports and imports. Now, because exports become a lot cheaper, the demand for exports is likely to rise a lot. For imports, because they become a lot more expensive, the demand for them is going to fall a lot. So the bigger the change in the exchange rate, the greater the end result is likely to be. Okay, so you just explain how that's going to lead to an increase in demand for exports and a reduction in the demand for imports to a weak currency, etc. So the size of the appreciation, the size of the depreciation is also very important. It also depends on whether there are restrictions on trade. That's something else to consider as well. If there are restrictions on trade, then we can't just assume that if our currency gets weaker, we can export more. What if foreign countries are actually restricting our exports? Maybe there are tariffs on our goods. Maybe there are quotas set on our goods. Whatever. There might be some restrictions on trade which kind of negate some of the impacts we've just said. We can also bring in the offset argument here. What if the effect on aggregate demand is offset by another feature, another factor that might decrease aggregate demand or increase aggregate demand? So if we take a weak currency, we've said aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. But what if there is another policy out there in the economy, something else in the economy which is going to offset this impact? We don't know about that, so it might be offset. And similarly, this one, the effect on exchange rates depends very heavily on incomes abroad. And that's especially true for a weak currency. Weak currency, with imports more expensive, exports cheap, we are assuming that we can just sell more exports. Demand for exports picks up, we can sell more, but it depends on incomes abroad. What if there's been a recession abroad in our major trading partners? Then maybe exports won't increase as much as we think. So incomes abroad are just as important when we're trying to determine the effect on the macroeconomy for exchange rate changes. I hope that makes sense now. You've got aggregate demand, which is a big feature here. The effect on trade, but you've also got the aggregate supply, the costs of imported raw materials, import and inflation, something else to consider as well. Thanks very much. See you next time.
6 devices, 1 VPN account? Not a problem. NordVPN from $275 a month.
Hi everybody. Aggregate demand is the total demand for a country's goods and services at a given price level in a given time.
Shut the fuck
That's
up.
a definition you need to know. More so, we use the equation, don't we, for aggregate demand. Remember, aggregate demand is a measure of total expenditure on a country's goods and services. Expenditure. So we are measuring the total spending taking place in an economy. Consumer spending, C. Investment spending by firms, that is the spending by firms on capital goods. Government spending and net export spending.
Don't kill,
where X is the value of exports, i.e. export revenues, and M is the value of imports, i.e. import expenditure. Always remember, it's a measure of spending is aggregate demand, okay? Not quantities, spending. Okay, when we draw an aggregate demand curve, we draw it downward sloping like this, where aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Remember to label the axis right, where we have price level and real GDP. And on the y-axis we use P's, on the x-axis we use Y's to represent real GDP. Why does the aggregate demand curve slope downwards? Why, when there is a fall in the price level, is there an increase in aggregate demand or an extension of AD and therefore an increase in real GDP? Why, when the price level increases, does aggregate demand reduce? There is a contraction of AD and therefore a fall in real GDP. Why does that take place? Well, there are 3 reasons why, and we're going to look at all 3 in a second. Remember that the downward slope makes reference to the fact that there is an inverse relationship between the price level and real GDP. There is an inverse relationship between the price level and the level of aggregate demand. Alright, so these 3 effects link to purely how changes in the price level can affect one or more of these variables. Aggregate demand can only ever change if C, I, G or X minus M increase or decrease. But if the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, it means aggregate demand is changing purely for reasons to do with the price level changing. What does the wealth effect say? The wealth effect says that as the price level decreases, let's say from P1 to P2, the purchasing power of income now increases. In real terms, people are richer. Therefore, they're more likely to spend money on goods and services in the economy, which will increase C. So consumption increases, but purely because the price level has changed. Therefore, there'll be an extension or an expansion of aggregate demand in the economy, and real GDP will increase for that reason. That's the wealth effect, the purchasing power of income increasing or decreasing when the price level changes, and then affecting consumption. The trade effect. Well, let's take a fall in the price level again. The trade effect states that as the price level decreases, for example, exports become more competitive and imports become less competitive. If exports become more competitive, there'll be a greater demand for exports, and the revenues generated from exports will increase, increasing X in this equation. At the same time, imports become less competitive because domestic goods and services are more competitive. So there'll be less spending on imports, which will reduce the value of M in the bracket. So as a result purely of a change in the price level, the value of X minus M will increase, aggregate demand will increase. Therefore, real GDP will increase, we move along the curve. Vice versa if the price level increases. That's the trade effect. What about the interest effect? Well, the interest effect states that as the price level decreases, for example, interest rates can be kept lower in the economy because most central banks will adopt interest rate policy to meet an inflation target. So if inflation is low, let's say at P2, then interest rates can be kept lower in the economy, and lower interest rates stimulate higher consumption, stimulates higher investment, okay, because the cost of borrowing is lower, and it also reduces the value of the exchange rate, which can then boost your net export performance in X minus M. Okay, so the interest effect links purely as a result of a change in the price level, which can then affect CI and X minus M, as interest rates are lower or higher in the economy, depending on what the change in the price level is. So crucially, all three effects explain why any of these variables in the AD equation will increase or decrease, but because only of changes in the price level. As a result, we see either extensions of aggregate demand when the price level decreases, or contractions of aggregate demand when the price level increases, thus increasing or decreasing real GDP in the economy. That is so important to take away, guys. So many students are very naive with why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. Not anymore, you can plug that gap. So when does the aggregate demand curve shift? Well, clearly the aggregate demand curve will shift when there is an increase or decrease in CIG and or X minus M, but nothing to do with the price level changing, independent of the price level. So consumption increases or decreases for reasons not to do with changes in the price level. Same with I, same with G, same with X minus M. Nothing to do with changes in the price level. So at one price level, aggregate demand can shift right or left. Yeah? There are other reasons why C, I, G and X minus M are changing, independent of the price level. That's when we shift the aggregate demand curve, and at the same price level you can see we can have higher or lower levels of aggregate demand and therefore higher or lower levels of real GDP. And we're going to cover all those reasons in the next few videos, so make sure you stay tuned and watch all those videos where I cover what factors independent of the price level can affect C, I, G and X minus M. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you all in those next videos.
Magnus, jag bara ville ställa en fråga.
Ja, jag har ju sagt att jag inte vill.
Hi everybody. Consumption is the total spending by households on goods and services in the economy. For countries like the UK and the US, consumption is a massively important part of aggregate demand. In the UK, for example, it accounts for around 66% of aggregate demand. In the US, it's something similar to that. Remember what the equation is for aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. We in this video are going to look at reasons why consumption can increase or decrease for reasons independent of the price level. So nothing to do with the price level, other reasons. So these are all factors that can then therefore shift aggregate demand right or left as a result of influencing C in the aggregate demand equation. Before we get started, something to bear in mind is to use the phrase the marginal propensity to consume in your chains of analysis here. So when you're writing long paragraphs as to how these factors can influence C, using the marginal propensity to consume will make you look amazing and more professional in your writing. The marginal propensity to consume is just the willingness of a household to spend any extra income that they earn. right? So it's something that you can use throughout. I'll be using it, use it as I do basically. But also make sure you mention the multiplier effect. Anytime that AD is shifting for any of these factors, let's say, you can always bring in the multiplier effect to bolster your analysis. Watch my video on the multiplier effect to understand it and then to know how to use it in your analysis. So, what factors can affect consumption independent of the price level? Well, the level of real disposable income, where real means adjusted for inflation, and disposable income is income left after taxes and national insurance have been paid. So, one reason why disposable income can increase is maybe if income taxes have been cut in the economy. So cuts in the marginal rate of income tax or increases in the tax-free allowance, which is the level of income you're allowed to earn before taxes are paid, before income tax is paid. So if you increase the tax-free allowance or if you cut the marginal rate of income tax, that is going to increase the level of real disposable income, which will therefore increase the marginal propensity to consume and therefore increase the level of consumption in the economy. If interest rates are cut, for example, then the cost of borrowing falls and the rate of return on saving falls. If the cost of borrowing falls, then that increases the incentive for consumers to go and borrow money, because it's cheaper to do so now, and to spend that money on expensive items like cars, like houses, like furniture, like jewellery, for example, and that will increase consumption in the economy. If interest rates are cut, the rate of return on saving decreases, so that reduces the incentive to save, and instead any income that's generated might go into consumption as a result, and that increases C. A lot of UK households will have mortgages, right? The way in which they can finance buying a house. And monthly, mortgages have to be repaid back, so there are monthly repayments on mortgages. And a lot of mortgages in this country are variable rate mortgages or tracker rate mortgages, where the level of repayments or the interest repayments are tracked to the base rate in the economy, to the central bank interest rate. So if interest rates are cut, it means monthly repayments could fall for households who have variable rate mortgages or tracker rate mortgages, which means monthly they have more disposable income to be able to spend in the economy, increasing C in that way. You also must bear in mind the availability of credit. If the availability of credit is low, then this can reduce the impact of borrowing. This can reduce the impact of lower interest rates, because simply banks are not willing to lend if the availability of credit is very, very low. So that's something that can stop this happening. It's something else which will affect C in the aggregate demand equation. Consumer confidence. If there is high consumer confidence, consumers are going to have a higher marginal propensity to consume. What can affect consumer confidence? Well, it's job prospects and the level of unemployment in the economy. So don't be vague in your writing and say, oh, expectations about the state of the economy. That is true, but then be more specific what you mean by that. Link very much to job prospects and the level of unemployment. So if people expect that they're going to get promoted soon, or that their job prospects are very, very strong, they're going to be more likely to spend money. Their MPC is going to be higher. If the level of unemployment is very low, then individuals will feel very bullish in their job. They'll feel very confident in their job prospects and are therefore more likely to spend money and not find a reason to save necessarily at that period of time. Asset prices. Now this is very important. Asset prices linked to wealth, how wealthy people feel. The wealthier people feel, the more likely they are to spend money, the higher the marginal propensity to consume. So what do we mean by asset prices? Well, things like house prices, share prices are a very good example, bond prices. If these are going up and individuals hold such assets, they feel wealthier, they're more likely to spend money. In countries like the UK, there is a very strong correlation between asset prices like house prices and share prices and the level of consumer spending in the economy. So that links to wealth, and wealth links to consumer spending, how wealthy people feel in this case. Their income hasn't actually changed, but they just feel like they are more rich, hence why they are more willing to spend their money. And also the level of household indebtedness. If there is a huge amount of household indebtedness in the economy, families living in huge debts, then individuals are more likely to save that money as opposed to spending their money just in case things go bad and they need to repay those debts quickly. They'd rather save that money to have a pool of money in the bank to then pay off debts in case things go bad, i.e. they lose their job or something like that takes place, or interest rates rise. So the greater amount of household indebtedness, the greater amount of saving and therefore less consumption taking place in the economy. So these are all the main factors that can affect consumption. There are other factors too, like the age structure of the population, like weather you can also argue as well, which can affect consumption. But these are the main ones. The key thing for you is to be able to develop a chain of analysis linking to consumption increasing or decreasing, and therefore aggregate demand increasing or decreasing using such phrases. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay tuned for the next video where we're going to look at savings, the determinant of savings. I'll see you all in the next video.
Här är alltså elcykel.
Det är en elcykel.
Går den på el?
Hi everybody.
Да дайте убью, блять, его. Зайди.
Saving is that part of disposable income that is not spent on goods and services in the economy. And savings is a determinant of AD. If savings increase in the economy, it means by default there is going to be less consumption taking place in the economy and AD will shift to the left. Remember, there are only two things that an individual can do with income that they earn. They can either spend it or save it. So if savings increase, it means consumption is decreasing. So savings is a determinant of AD by affecting consumption, the level of consumption in the economy. So what kind of factors can affect saving? Well, the level of real disposable income. Of course that can affect saving. If incomes rise, we don't spend all of our money. Right? So if incomes rise, yes, consumption can increase, but saving can increase too. So the level of real disposable income can definitely affect the level of saving. Without income, you can't save, can you? In developing countries, this is a very big point. Even in developed countries like the UK, you know, the poor households save a very, very, very small percent of their income. Most of it has to go in consumption activity. So the level of real disposable income is a key determinant of saving. Interest rates. Higher interest rates will encourage more saving. Why? Because the rate of return on savings is going to increase. If you save your money in a bank account and interest rates are quite high, then you're going to get a nice rate of return on the money that you place in your saving account over a period of a year, which is a big incentive for you to save and therefore not to spend in the economy instead. So high interest rates increase the marginal propensity to save and therefore the level of saving in the economy. Low interest rates will do the opposite and will encourage more borrowing and spending and less saving in the economy. The level of consumer confidence. If consumer confidence is very low in the economy because people fear a recession coming up, they fear losing their jobs, or they think that their incomes are going to take a cut, then individuals are more likely to save money in preparation for that. So low consumer confidence encourages more saving and less consumer spending in the economy, whereas if there is high consumer confidence, that encourages more spending and less saving in the economy. This point here, number 4, is very important for developing countries. The range and the trustworthiness of financial institutions. In developing countries, financial institutions like banks simply don't exist in the kind of volume that they do in developed countries, and often they are corrupt or non-trustworthy. They might be unofficial, which again reduces, of course, the incentive to save in them. Another key barrier is just education in developing countries. Do individuals or families know about the benefits of saving, about how a bank operates, about what interest rates are? Maybe not, and that could be a barrier to saving as well. But all of these reasons, a poor range of financial institutions, corrupt banks, non-trustworthy banks, unreliable banks, unofficial banks, can all prevent saving taking place, especially in developing countries. You see this a lot. Tax incentives like ISAs, so the government policy is basically to encourage more saving. An ISA is an individual saving account where you can have savings and earn returns on savings which are tax-free up to a certain threshold. So basically this is a way to save money to protect yourself from paying income tax or capital gains taxes on the savings that you put in bank accounts. So incentives like this can encourage more saving, especially as now the ISA tax allowance is around £15,500 right now. It's a very high tax allowance on savings. That very much encourages savings and therefore can increase the level of saving in the economy the more that you have policies that encourage it. An economist called Modigliani argued that the age structure of the population has got a big role to play in the level of savings. He argued that the middle-aged individual is more likely to save their money for their children and for their own retirement, whereas those who are younger, so between the ages of 15 and 30 in the economy, more likely to spend their money, and the pensioners, so those who are aged above 60 years old, are more likely to spend their money too, whereas those who fit in between that gap are more likely to save their money. So the middle-aged population are likely to save their money. So if you have a population where that is the majority of your population, then likelihood is that savings are going to rise if you believe the thesis of Modigliani. So here are some of the key determinants of saving in the economy. Hope that makes sense. I'll see you all in the next video.
Missa inte Green Friday på cdon.com. Vi fortsätter hela helgen.
Hi everybody, let's continue by looking at the determinants of investment. Investment is a key part of the aggregate demand equation, and if investment increases or decreases, aggregate demand will shift either right or left. Investment can mean many different things, so in economics by default, we say that investment is when firms spend money on capital goods to increase their productive capacity. So always go there by default, when firms spend money on capital goods. That's what we mean by investment in economics. So what factors can influence the level of investment? Well, interest rates can. Firms will finance investment in two main ways, either by borrowing money or by investing retained profits that they have. So interest rates are crucial, therefore, when it comes to borrowing money, isn't it? So if interest rates are low in the economy, it means that the cost of borrowing is low. It means that firms have got a greater incentive to borrow money and then to invest. The marginal propensity to invest will increase if interest rates are lower. What you can also bring in with interest rates is the notion of the hurdle. The hurdle is the required rate of return that firms need for investment projects to go ahead. So if interest rates are lower, it means reaching that hurdle, that required rate of return, becomes a bit easier, therefore again increasing the marginal propensity to invest, increasing borrowing for investment. However, if interest rates are high, the opposite will happen. Investment will be lower and aggregate demand will shift left. The level of business confidence is very important as well in determining investment. Don't be that student that says, oh, business confidence is determined by the state of the economy or the expected state of the economy in the future. That is true, but it's a bit vague. Be more specific as to what determines business confidence. Business confidence is determined by two key expectations by firms: the expectation of future profit and the expectation of future demand in the economy. If the expectation of profit and demand in the economy is high going forward, then businesses are more likely to invest. Their marginal propensity to invest is going to be higher to meet the level of demand in the future, to make sure that investment takes place whereby they can supply the demand in the future that they're expecting. So high business confidence is likely to incentivize investment, whereas if business confidence is low and businesses expect profit to be low in the future, they expect demand to be low in the future, there is no need to invest to increase capacity, is there? And so low business confidence implies less investment and therefore lower aggregate demand in the economy. The level of corporation tax, of course, is going to affect investment. Use the phrase retained profit here. Retained profit is the profit left after corporation tax has been paid, where corporation tax is a tax on business profits. The lower the corporation tax, the higher the level of retained profit is going to be, the greater potential the business has to invest, therefore. Remember what I just said? That there are two main ways of financing investment: borrowing money or by using retained profits. So if corporation tax is low, retained profit is going to be higher. Businesses can therefore use those retained profits to invest. Whereas if corporation taxes are high, retained profit is going to be lower, investment is going to be lower. Spare capacity. Businesses have got lots of spare capacity. There is no need to invest, to buy more capital machinery, to build a new factory, let's say. There is no need to do that because there is so much spare capacity that could be used up instead to increase supply, to increase production. So the greater the level of spare capacity, the less the marginal propensity to invest, the less investment. Whereas if businesses are operating very close to full capacity, then there is a very good incentive to invest, to increase capacity. The level of competition is massive, and the level of technology that there is in the economy. If competition is strong and lots of competitors are improving their technology, are spending more on capital machinery, are innovating, or spending more on R&D, likelihood is that businesses will react to that and also spend money on investment and at least get to a level of technology that is equal to their rivals, if not better than the technology of their rivals. So if competition is high, you can expect a huge amount of investment to take place for businesses to get ahead of their competition by bringing in brand new capital, more efficient capital, or new technology, or looking to increase the size of their factories to produce more to get ahead of their competitors. And of course the price of capital machinery. If the price of capital is low, then investment is less costly, the marginal propensity to invest is higher, and investment is likely to increase. Of course it is. Don't forget the accelerator effect. This is very much linked to investment as well. Of course it is. And the accelerator effect is when there is an increasing rate of real GDP in the economy, which then encourages further investment. A bit like what we said with respect to business confidence. If the expected level of demand in the economy is going to be high, that encourages more investment. The accelerator idea is pretty much linked to that, and it states that if the rate of real GDP in the economy is increasing, that is going to encourage more investment, which will increase the rate of real GDP, which encourages more investment, etc., etc. So the accelerator idea you can also bring in to the whole topic area of investment. That covers the determinants of investment. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay tuned for the next video where we look at government spending. I'll see you then. Hi everybody, government spending is a key component of the aggregate demand equation, which is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Governments will often spend money to influence the level of economic activity, to influence both short-run and long-run growth. So it's a very, very important part of how the economy works, and especially in influencing AD, which is short-run growth, AD shifting right or left. What are the different types of government spending that can take place in the economy? Well, you have got, first of all, current spending. Current spending is just the spending on the maintenance of key public sector services, so the maintenance of the NHS, for example, the maintenance of state schooling, the maintenance of key infrastructures that there might be. But it's also the payment of public sector wages, so all of the workers that work for the government in the public sector, the payment of their wages would go under current spending. Capital spending is the spending on infrastructure projects, so the spending on the building of new hospitals, the building of new schools, the building of new roads, new bridges, new airports, new ports, new railway lines. All of that will count as infrastructure spending, which is capital spending. You've also got welfare spending. This for the UK is the biggest chunk of government spending, and that is spending on benefits and pensions. So in the UK, benefits like unemployment benefit, child support benefit, disability benefit, etc., and pensions to the elderly. That is a big, big chunk, and for many developed countries, this is the biggest part of government spending. But also debt interest payments. Debt interest payments, we know that debts for many countries around the world are now spiraling out of control. And anytime governments take on more debt, there is interest to pay on that debt. And all the interest payments will fall under the debt interest category of government spending. Important for you to know that 1, 2 and 3 would all act as an injection into the circular flow of an economy, but Number 4 would not. So number 1, 2 and 3 are all spendings that would shift aggregate demand to the right, whereas debt interest payments would not. Debt interest payments is not a payment that is staying in the country necessarily. It's not an injection into the circular flow of income, into the economy, whereas 1, 2 and 3 directly are. Okay? But debt interest payments are a huge sum, right? The opportunity cost of that is ridiculous. In the UK, debt interest payments yearly are around £50 billion. To put that into context, state schooling is around £90 billion in the UK economy. The NHS costs around £110 billion. Yeah, so 50 or £51 billion a year in debt interest carries a huge opportunity cost. But there you go. Right, we also need to know some key terms when it comes to government spending. Anytime you're talking about government spending in the economy, these terms I'm sure you're going to be using. And for you, the key difference between a budget deficit and the national debt you need to be aware of too. So let's consider, what is a budget deficit? Well, a budget deficit is where government spending is greater than taxation revenues in a fiscal year. In a year, basically. The fiscal year in the UK is between April and April. So crucially, this is borrowing in 1 year. If the government is spending more than they are receiving in tax revenues, they must be borrowing the difference. But it's borrowing only in 1 year. Budget surplus is the opposite. So this is where government spending is less than taxation revenues. But again, in a fiscal year, in 1 year. National debt, on the other hand, how is this different to a budget deficit? Well, this is the total stock of debt over time. It's the total stock of debt, right? So this is a stock concept, we call it, in economics, your total, whereas this is a flow concept, how much debt you have just in 1 year. Okay? So you can say that the national debt is an accumulation of years' worth of budget deficits. Yeah? So if you have a budget deficit, when that year is over, you're back to a balanced budget again. Yeah? You start again from zero. Whereas after 1 year's worth of budget deficit, you are adding towards the total amount of national debt. So 5 years worth of budget deficits would really increase national debt. Whereas after those years, the budget balance goes back to zero again. Okay? Whereas a country that runs a budget surplus, after 1 year, the budget balance goes to zero, the national debt will be coming down. All right? So the national debt is total debt over time, the total stock of debt over time, whereas a budget deficit, think of it as debt just in 1 year. So that covers government spending, guys. Stay tuned for the next video where we look at determinants of net exports. I'll see you then. Hi everybody, let's continue by looking at factors that can shift the aggregate demand curve, focusing this time on net exports. Remember the equation for aggregate demand, which is C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government spending, plus X minus M, which is net exports. Let's now look at factors that can determine whether net exports increase or decrease, and therefore whether aggregate demand increases or decreases. If the value of this bracket increases, aggregate demand will shift to the right. How could that happen? Well, exports could increase and/or imports could decrease. That would increase the value of the bracket and shift AD right. If the value of the bracket was to fall, then AD would shift to the left. So a fall in exports, a rise in imports. Now remember, aggregate demand is a measure of spending in the economy. So you can't just say exports rise in quantity or imports rise in quantity. You've got to be specific. You've got to make sure that you talk about export revenues coming into the country and import expenditure, because that is what is going to be measured in the aggregate demand equation, not the quantity of exports sold or the quantity of imports bought into the country. So be careful with that. Right, what factors can influence the level of net exports in the economy? Well, real disposable income earned abroad. So if there is a boom abroad, for example, then folks abroad are getting richer, their marginal propensity to import goods is likely to increase, which means that for a domestic country like the UK, the demand for our exports is likely to increase. So if there is higher income abroad, demand for exports is likely to increase, which is going to increase export revenues, ceteris paribus, and therefore shift aggregate demand to the right by increasing X minus M. Vice versa, if there is a recession abroad, especially in the countries of our major trading partners, so take the UK, that could be a recession in the USA, a recession in Germany, then the marginal propensity for those guys to import is going to reduce. Therefore, the demand for UK exports is going to reduce. the revenues generated from UK exports will reduce, reducing X minus M, shifting AD left. Similarly, real disposable income earned at home. So if there is a boom in the UK, the marginal propensity to import in the UK is likely to rise. We call that the sucking in effect of imports. The sucking in of imports is likely to take place, right? And therefore our import expenditure is likely to rise. So that's going to increase M in the X minus M bracket, which is going to pull down the value of the bracket and is going to shift AD to the left. However, if we get poorer, so if there is a recession at home and we get poorer, the marginal propensity to import is going to reduce. We suck in, love that, don't you? We suck in less imports, therefore the import expenditure is likely to fall, increasing the value of the bracket and shifting AD to the right, ceteris paribus. Of course, exchange rates have a massive influence on X minus M. Strong exchange rates or weak exchange rates. Now, keep things simple, guys, yeah? Keep things really simple. When you think strong or weak exchange rates, go straight to my mnemonic devices, these memory devices, SPICE and WIDEC. When we think SPICE, we think strong pound, imports cheap, exports dear. You got me on that one. And WIDEC, that's the opposite. Weak exchange rate, imports dear, exports cheap. That makes your life super easy, guys. Don't overcomplicate. Don't let your mind go into weird directions. Keep things really, really simple. Those two mnemonic devices is going to help you like crazy. So if you have a strong exchange rate, it means imports are cheap and exports are dear. If imports are cheap, what's going to happen to demand for imports? Well, in theory, demand for imports will rise and expenditure on imports will rise. Not good. That will increase the value of M. At the same time, exports are more expensive. They're dearer. That means demand for exports will fall and revenues generated from exports will fall, reducing X. So a lower X and a higher M, this bracket is going to fall in value and shift AD left. A strong exchange rate, bad for an economy in terms of AD shifting left. Weak exchange rate, the opposite will happen. Imports become more expensive, therefore demand for imports will fall, and the expenditure on imports is going to fall as well. Good, so the value of N is going to go down. Exports become cheaper, so demand for exports increase. The revenues generated from exports will increase, increasing the value of X. Therefore, the value of this bracket will be higher, shifting AD to the right. So a weak exchange rate, especially for a trading economy like Japan or China or Germany, is great news because X minus M will increase and AD will shift to the right. Okay? So that's a big determinant of X minus M and therefore of AD. Protectionism at home and abroad, of course. Right? So if there is strong protectionism abroad, maybe tariffs on UK exports, quotas on UK exports, maybe even sanctions or embargoes on UK exports, or non-tariff barriers on UK exports, that might prevent us being able to access international markets with our exports and will reduce the amount of export revenue we can generate. So if there is strong protectionism abroad, the value of X is going to be lower. Vice versa, if there is very low levels of protectionism abroad, it might be easier for us to access international markets and to sell exports and to earn revenues. However, if there is protectionism at home which is strong, it might mean that the value of import expenditure is going to be low. So if we have high tariffs on imports coming in from abroad, or quotas on imports from abroad, or if we have embargoes on imports from abroad, it will reduce import expenditure, ceteris paribus, and therefore reduce the value of M and help to shift AD to the right as the value of this bracket increases. Okay? So protectionism at home and abroad is a key determinant of import expenditure and export revenue. And also relative inflation levels at home. The word relative is very important. Comparing inflation levels to other countries, not just looking at inflation in isolation at home, but looking at inflation relative to inflation rates abroad. So if inflation in the UK is higher than inflation in other countries around the world, especially in the countries of our major trading partners, then our exports are going to be less competitive, demand for exports is going to be lower, the amount of export revenue generated will be lower. So high relative inflation reduces export competitiveness, reduces revenues from exports, reduces X in this bracket, which can then shift AD to the left. But if there is low relative inflation in the UK, vice versa, demand for exports can pick up, our exports are more competitive, and therefore revenues can increase, shifting AD to the right as the value of X minus M increases. We could also look at relative inflation in terms of what might happen to import expenditure. So if there is high relative inflation at home, it's not just exports that become less competitive, but imports become more competitive. It might be cheaper to buy those goods and services from abroad if they can be imported, as opposed to buying them at home, where inflation is higher. So if there is higher relative inflation, yes, exports are less competitive, but imports become more competitive. So also our import expenditure may rise. So bear that all in mind. These are all the key determinants of x minus m. If x minus m goes up in value, AD will shift to the right. If x minus m goes down in value, AD will shift to the left. Okay? So looking at export revenues and import expenditures is key when you link all these factors to the x minus m equation. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hopefully that all made sense. Normally students are not very good at determinants of x minus m. They get very confused. So do ensure you've taken this in and you're confident with this theory. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. Hi everybody, let's in this video cover aggregate supply. By the end, we'll be able to put aggregate supply and aggregate demand together to get macro equilibrium. The next video in this playlist covers that topic area. Unfortunately, aggregate supply is quite a heavy and complex topic area because it's heavily disputed in the economics world. You've got Keynesian economists with their own interpretation of aggregate supply. You've got classical economists with their own interpretation of aggregate supply. Neither school is right, neither school is wrong, so it's totally up to you to use whichever aggregate supply interpretation you want to use. It's not going to be wrong. Use whatever you're comfortable with. But what you need to know is why they differ and what aggregate supply looks like in both the different models here. Let's get straight into the classical interpretation. In the classical model, you can have short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. Short-run aggregate supply looks like this, upward sloping. The position of short-run aggregate supply is determined by costs of production in the economy. If costs of production change, the short-run aggregate supply will shift. If there is an increase in costs of production, SRS will shift to the left. If there is a decrease in costs of production, SRS will shift to the right. Now, we're talking about costs of production that can affect all firms in the economy. So we're not just talking on a micro level, this is clearly a macro level. What costs of production can change that will affect all firms in the economy? Well, wages, for example. If wages throughout the economy go up, then that is going to increase costs of production for firms in the economy. SRS will shift to the left from SRS1 to SRS3 here. If wages decrease, that's going to reduce costs of production for firms in the economy, shifting SRS to the right. If raw material or commodity prices go up, then costs of production will rise for firms in the economy, shifting SRS to the left. If they fall, then SRS will shift to the right because there is a decrease in cost of production for firms in the economy. Oil is a major cost of production, so it's okay for the UK economy, for example, to keep the oil price as a separate cost of production factor, even though it should really fall into this category. Oil is such an important input for all firms in the UK economy, whether it's for transportation of their goods, whether it's to access goods themselves, whether it's an actual input in their actual production. Oil price is so important. When the oil price goes up, costs of production for all firms in the economy will increase, thus shifting SRS to the left, whereas if the oil price decreases, that will reduce costs of production, shifting SRS to the right. Business taxes like VAT clearly impact costs of production. If VAT goes up, that will increase costs of production. If VAT goes down, that will reduce costs of production for all firms in the economy, shifting SRS whichever way. Don't forget import prices. Import prices is massive, especially for firms in the UK economy that rely on imports of raw materials, of commodities, in order to produce. And import prices can change when the exchange rate changes. So when there is a strong exchange rate, imports are cheaper. That means for firms who import raw materials, who import commodities, they will see a big drop in their costs of production, where SRS will shift to the right. Whereas when there is a weak exchange rate, import prices become much more expensive. So for firms who import raw materials and commodities, their cost of production will increase, shifting SRS to the left. So it says spiced and WIDEC. Remember these memory devices, where spiced is for a strong exchange rate and WIDEC is for a weak exchange rate. Strong pound, imports cheap, exports dear. So imports cheap, weak pound or weak currency, imports dear. So there's the link to import prices and there's the link to SRS and costs of production. Another good thing to keep in your mind, yes, costs of production, a great way to simplify this, but just think shocks. When SRS shifts, there is a supply side shock in the economy because This shift can happen very quickly. These are all very quick, potentially even overnight factors that can shift SRAS. So these are shocks to the economy. They can be positive. If SRAS shifts to the right, we have a fall in cost of production, a positive supply side shock. They could also be negative when SRAS shifts to the left and we see negative growth. And when we put AD on our diagram, higher inflation too. That's a negative supply side shock which can lead to a phenomenon called stagflation. So learn them also as supply side shocks. They can quickly shock the economy on the supply side here. What about the classical interpretation of LRAS? Well, in the classical model, LRAS is vertical to represent one level of output the economy will always produce at in the long run. And that level of output is YFE. Let's define YFE now. YFE is the full employment level of output, and it represents the maximum level of output an economy can produce using all factors of production at sustainable levels. Now that end part is really important, sustainable levels, which means it is possible to deviate from that, even to increase output beyond YFE, if we're using factors of production unsustainably. So for example, if we're using labour overtime, too much overtime work going on, eventually labour will burn out, unsustainable production. If we're using capital overtime, right, so machinery is being used 24/7, eventually that machinery will break down, unsustainable production. So YFE, the maximum level of output an economy can produce using all factors of production at sustainable levels. Classical economists believe that it's only one level of output, which is why the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, because according to classical economists, we are always going to be there in the long run, this one level of output. LRAS reflects that output position. When the economy is at the natural rate of unemployment, that's when we are at the full employment level of output. So that's how we can measure whether we are here or not. In the UK, for example, the natural rate of unemployment is 4.5%. I know it's a bit disputed, but many economists will agree. It's at 4.5% unemployment. When we are there, then economists agree that we are fully employing all of our factors of production, all of our resources in the economy. Therefore, we must be at the full employment level of output. How can this curve shift left or right? Well, let's take an LRAS shift to the right. Really simplify this, guys, to avoid confusion. Many students will make lots of errors when they try and explain why LRAS shifts to the right. Simplify it by using this memory device. The quantity and the quality of our factors of production. I say Q squared of cell. Quantity and quality of capital, enterprise, land and labour. If the quantity and or the quality of our factors of production are increasing and improving, then LRAS can shift to the right. Also, there might be an improvement in the productive efficiency of the economy. So no change in our factors of production, but there is an improvement in productive efficiency. Learn this as a fall in long-run costs of production. None of these long-run costs of production are falling, and that will remain the case for a long period of time. Thus, the productive efficiency of the economy is improving. So 3 ways in which LRS can shift to the right. An increase in the quantity of our factors of production, an increase in the quality of our factors of production, and an improvement in the productive efficiency of the economy there. Okay, if that happens, LRAS will shift to the right from LRAS1 to LRAS2, and potentially the economy can produce more, from YFE1 to YFE2. What factors could cause that? So for example, labour productivity improving. That will increase the quality of labour, they're shifting LRAS to the right. It could be an increase in investment throughout the economy. Remember what investment is, guys. It's when firms spend money on capital goods. A big tip for you in your essays is to always give examples of investment whenever you talk about it. So it could be, for example, technology advances, research and development spending, new factory development, it could be new machines being bought in, it could be machine upgrades, new software, it could be a fleet of new vehicles being bought, whatever. Just make sure you give examples which is clearly when firms are spending money on capital goods. Now, clearly that's going to increase the quantity of capital, it could increase the quality of capital, and over time it could improve the productive efficiency of the economy as long-run costs of production for firms decrease. Thus, LRAS can shift for all 3 ways there. Infrastructure improvements are so important. Let's take transport infrastructure. So for example, building new roads, upgrading roads, building new airports, new runways, new railway lines, bridges. Transport infrastructure will reduce long-run costs for all businesses in the economy, because it means that transporting goods and services becomes quicker, becomes cheaper, becomes more efficient. Therefore, the long-run cost of production for firms decrease, improving the productive efficiency of the economy, shifting LRS to the right. Another way to look at infrastructure improvements, for example, new, pipe infrastructure, maybe it's electricity pylons, maybe it is transport infrastructure, you can argue that the quantity and quality of the capital stock in the economy improves, thus shifting LRS to the right as well. Even if it's new schools and new hospitals being built, that's an increase in the quantity of capital. You can shift LRS to the right as a result. So infrastructure, we can go to productive efficiency with transport infrastructure, we can go to the quantity of the capital stock and the quality of the capital stock as well to shift LRS to the right. We can look at increases in the quantity of labour. So maybe this is immigration. So migrants coming into the country of a working age will increase the size of the labour force. When we say quantity of labour, it's the size of the labour force that we're talking about, not the unemployed becoming employed, because the unemployed are also part of the labour force. It's increasing the size of the labour force. Right? So migrants coming in of a working age, maybe it's incentives, like reducing benefits, like cutting income tax, for example, where the inactive become active, increasing the quantity of labour. We can look at competition. Competition is massive for productive efficiency improvement. So maybe it's privatisation, maybe it's deregulation, maybe it's trade liberalisation, maybe it's competition policy generally. If competition improves throughout the economy, then firms are going to be looking to reduce their costs as much as possible to stay competitive, to beat their rivals. And that is going to increase productive efficiency throughout the economy and shift LRS to the right. We can also look at new resource discovery. So this comes under the land category. We find new resources, that's the quantity of land increasing, thus shifting LRS to the right. What about LRS shifting to the left in the economy? Well, that could happen if there is a big decrease in labour productivity in the economy. It could happen if there is mass capital depreciation, which shifts LRS to the left. It could be war, conflict, a natural disaster which destroys infrastructure, which reduces the quantity of capital. It could be these three things which leads to death, which reduces the quantity of labour. It could be a pandemic, so a health crisis in the economy which severely affects the productivity of labour. If that causes death, that can decrease the quantity of labour. It could be hysteresis. Remember that hysteresis is a phenomenon caused by long-term unemployment where eventually workers become discouraged and they drop out of the labour force, reducing the quantity of labour. It could be emigration from the economy. So when labour of a working age, so workers of a working age, actually leave the economy, and that reduces the quantity of labour. So all of these factors can shift LRS to the left. What about the Keynesian interpretation then? Keynesians do not dispute at all the reasons why the LRS curve can shift to the right and to the left. So all the factors we've talked about, Keynesians 100% agree with. So shifting right, increasing potential output, shifting left, decreasing potential output. Absolutely fine, no disagreement there. The disagreement occurs over the shape of LRS and what LRS actually represents. So Keynesian economists totally dispute the idea of there being a short-run aggregate supply and a long-run aggregate supply. They say that's totally useless. There is a point where we reach full employment, where the curve becomes vertical, they believe. But they say that, look, the economy can be producing less than YFE, and that could be a long-run level of output. There isn't just one long-run level of output that the economy will always be at. No way. If the economy is producing below YFE, that could be a long-run equilibrium in the economy. They also heavily dispute the shape, right? And they say that the shape is bendy looking like this, due to the level of spare capacity in the economy. So for example, they say that if the economy is in deep recession, where output is way below full employment, they say that it's possible to increase production without there being any increase in inflationary pressure at all. And that is because there is mass unemployment of factors of production. Unemployment of labour, unemployment of capital, unemployment of land. So to increase production from here to here, for example, it's very easy for firms to use up the excess labour, to use up the excess capital without having to pay more for them. So wages, for example, will not rise. Capital, for example, the price of it will not rise, which means that the inflation rate will remain constant at times of deep recession when we increase production on the horizontal part of Keynesian LRS. However, the closer we get to YFE, the more that we are using up our spare capacity, the more pressure is being put on our existing factors of production. So now labour is becoming scarcer. So to employ labour, wages will have to rise. Capital is becoming scarcer. So to employ capital, firms will have to pay more for that capital. That will increase their cost of production. They're going to pass that on via higher prices in the economy, and that will increase the inflation rate. eventually to a point where we are fully utilizing all of our factors of production and it's not possible to increase output sustainably anymore. There will only be an increase in inflation. That's when the Keynesian aggregate supply curve becomes vertical. But crucially, they believe that we are not always at YFE at all. We could be below YFE, and that could be a long-run equilibrium in the economy. So that covers aggregate supply in detail. Hopefully now you get it. The next video we're going to look at macro equilibrium, where we put AD and AS together. Stay tuned for that. I'll see you all in that video. Hi everybody, macroeconomic equilibrium occurs where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. The problem is though, there are so many different ways of showing aggregate supply, meaning there are numerous ways of showing macro equilibrium. In this video we're going to cover all those different ways, looking at the classical model and the Keynesian model. Let's go straight to the classical model. Classical economists believe that there are two types of equilibrium. We have short-run macro equilibrium and we have long-run macro equilibrium. Short-run equilibrium occurs where AD equals SRAS but does not equal LRAS. There are two ways of showing that. This diagram here and the middle diagram here are both short-run equilibria. Let's look at this left-hand diagram first. You can see that where AD equals SRAS is not equal to LRAS. We're producing Y1 in the economy, not YFE. This deviation must be a short-run equilibrium according to classical economists because we're not at YFE. In the long run, this will not persist, we'll get back to YFE. This is known as a deflationary gap, or a recessionary gap, or a negative output gap. They all mean the same thing. I cover those concepts in much more detail in my output gaps video in this playlist. Go and have a look at that for further detail. And we can also look at it in this way, where AD equals SRAS is not equal to LRAS. We're producing an output level in the economy which is greater than YFE, and that cannot persist in the long run. In the long run, we get back to YFE. This is known as an inflationary gap or a positive output gap. Again, my output gaps video covers that in more detail. How on earth is that possible? Well, remember what YFE is. YFE is the maximum level of output an economy can produce using all of its factors of production at sustainable levels. So it is possible to produce beyond YFE if we use our factors of production unsustainably. So for example, we use labour unsustainably. They're working overtime, too much overtime. They're going to burn out. If we use capital machinery 24 hours a day, that's unsustainable. That again will burn out, will break down. So it's possible in the short run to produce there, but in the long run it's not. We're going to be back at YFE. So this deviation must be a short run equilibrium in the classical model. Long run equilibrium is when AD equals SRAS. Crucially, it also equals LRAS. So you can see what that looks like here, where AD equals SRAS is equal to LRAS, i.e. the economy is at the full employment level of output. Bam, there are no gaps here, deflationary gap or recessionary gap, negative output gap. Here, inflationary gap or a positive output gap. No gaps here, we are at YFE, where AD equals SRAS is equal to LRAS. The Keynesian way of showing macroeconomic equilibrium is so much easier. Remember the Keynesian LRS curve looking like that? Wherever AD cuts it, that could be a long-run equilibrium in the Keynesian model. So where I've shown here, AD cuts LRS, we have Y1 and P1, even though we're not at YFE, according to Keynesians, that could be a long-run equilibrium. If I drew AD on the vertical part of LRS, that could be long-run equilibrium when we are at YFE. But if I drew AD here on the horizontal part, right, that could be a long-run equilibrium too. So for Keynesian economists, wherever AD is on the LRAS curve, that is macroeconomic equilibrium, and that can persist in the long run. So very easy showing it there, different interpretations in the classical model. That covers macroeconomic equilibrium. Stay tuned for the next video when we look at shifts of all these different curves. I'll see you then. Hi everybody, so you're really comfortable with macro equilibrium. Now you're looking at shifting these curves. You might think this is an absolute piece of cake, but you've got to make sure you're 100% confident with it, given the number of times you're going to be shifting AD, SRAS, LRAS in your examinations, in your essays. Let's look at a shift of AD first. There are two ways of using the classical model to shift AD, and then we'll look at the Keynesian interpretation. Let's start simple with the classical model and just have SRAS and AD. So there we are. Equilibrium is here at Y1 and P1. Let's just take an AD shift to the right in each case. We've got AD1 to AD2, that's shifting it right, and then we're showing an increase in economic growth, and an increase in demand pull inflationary pressure. So this is a very simplified version, but 100% correct. We don't have an LRAS on here. We don't need it if we're just trying to show some very, very simple outcomes of increased growth and increased demand pull inflationary pressure. So that's one way of using the classical model. A second way includes LRAS, and it looks something like this. So start in the same way, AD and SRS, there we go. But now we can stick on an LRAS curve, right, maybe over here. Right, we need to label now, so there's full employment. There is currently a gap in the economy, a deflationary gap, a recessionary gap, a negative output gap, whatever you want to call it, with a price level of P1. So if you want to start there, then you can shift AD to the right, from AD1 to AD2, and we're showing exactly the same outcomes, an increase in economic growth and an increase in demand pull inflationary pressure. But at least now you've got YFE, so maybe for some evaluation, for talking about spare capacity being exhausted, moving towards YFE, this might be better for you if you want to be a bit more technical and you want LRS to be included on your diagram. For Keynes, it's a lot easier. There's only one way of showing a shift of AD. Remember, the Keynesian LRS curve looks something like that. Alright, so stick AD on. A good idea is to make sure that AD is cutting LRS at the sweet spot, the bendy part of LRS, and then you'll show exactly the same outcomes as we're showing above. So AD1 to AD2, where we're seeing an increase in economic growth from Y1 to Y2. You've also got YFE, remember, don't forget to label that. And we're also showing an increase in demand pull inflationary pressure from P1 to P2. So very simple using Keynes right there. The beauty of using Keynes is you've got lots of evaluation on one diagram. So if AD was on the horizontal part, there wouldn't be the inflationary pressure. If AD was on the vertical part, there wouldn't be the increase in growth. There would just be inflationary pressure. So this one is very powerful for evaluation. If you're shifting AD to the left, you've got the same three options, just shift AD the other way. So that covers shifts of AD. Let's now move on to SRS, shifting either right or left. Shifts of SRS is really simple. It's a classical model phenomena, so you have to use that. Use the simplified version. So we've got SRS there. We've got AD, cutting it. Keep it as simple as that. Equilibrium at Y1, price level at P1, and then just shift SRS whichever way. So if you want to show a positive supply side shock from SRS1 to SRS2 with an increase in economic growth and a reduction in cost push inflationary pressure, or if you want to show a negative supply side shock, then shift SRS to the left from SRS1 to SRS3, a decrease in economic growth and an increase in cost push inflationary pressure, also known as stagflation, that phenomenon. So that's how you shift SRS if there is a change in cost of production that affects all firms in the economy. Simple as that. Let's now look at LRS. For shifts of LRAS, again, you've got two options, the classical model or the Keynesian model. Both are really, really simple. Do whichever one you prefer. Let's look at the classical model first. Right, we'll start with long-run aggregate supply. We know it's vertical like that. And just have an AD curve. Right, so simplifying it like that. We've got YFE there, and we've got our price level there at P1. And then just shift LRAS. Let's say we're shifting LRAS to the right, in which case our new LRAS curve is going to look like that. From LRAS1 to LRAS2, we see lower cost push inflation. So what we're showing here is an increase in both actual and potential growth, and we're showing a reduction in cost push inflationary pressure, just with an AD curve on it like that. It's simplified, but it's going to score you 100% of the marks available for the diagram if you use it in your essay. So that's the classical way of showing it. My recommendation, very simple. You've also got the Keynesian interpretation. So remember, the Keynesian LRAS curve looks like that. Right, now, what I'd recommend, to get this one drawn correctly, make sure your AD curve is cutting LRAS in the bendy part, in the sweet spot here. And then when we shift LRAS, you'll have 4 different real GDP levels on your x-axis here. So let's get AD looking something like that. Alright, so your initial equilibrium is there at Y1, and we've got the price level there at P1, then shift LRAS to the right, like this. So from LRAS1 to LRAS2, What we're then showing is a new full employment level of output from YFE1 to YFE2. So there's your increase in potential growth, but then you've also got an increase in actual growth from Y1 to Y2, and a reduction in cost push inflationary pressure from P1 to P2. Alright, so there's the Keynesian way. You're going to have 4 Y values on your x-axis here, and you're going to have the reduction in cost push inflationary pressure. That's the Keynesian interpretation. Whichever one you prefer using, it doesn't matter. You'll score full marks whichever way you go, as long as you draw it correctly. That covers shifts. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next video when we look at output gaps. See you then. Alright, let's look at some exam techniques, shall we? So, something I'm sure you'll end up drawing in your exam, probably both diagrams to be honest, is a shift of aggregate demand and a shift of aggregate supply, both of which will probably form the heart of your analysis. In which case you need to know how to talk about these effects very carefully, and you need to make sure they explain the effects on the macroeconomic indicators with crisp, concise and clear detail. So, let's have a look at both shifts. Shifts of aggregate demand and shifts of aggregate supply. Right, aggregate demand shifts to the right for a whole host of reasons which doesn't really matter. So for some reason aggregate demand shifts to the right. We then need to analyse the effect on the 4 key macroeconomic variables, of which we have growth, employment, inflation and trade position. We need to be able to do all 4 from one diagram. So from one diagram, what's going on to these 4 objectives when aggregate demand shifts to the right? Well, we can see on the diagram there is going to be an increase in growth, isn't there? Real GDP increases from Y1 to Y2. So growth in the economy increases. Unemployment in the economy is going to decrease because of an increase in growth. I'm going to explain why in a second. Inflation, as you can see from the diagram, is going to increase. The price level increase from P1 to P2. And the trade position is actually going to worsen. It's no good just stating those 4. So many students just state these things and think, yeah, done it, happy. No, you will be capped. You won't score very many marks for doing that. You need to explain why exactly these things are happening. So let's go through one by one. Why does growth increase? Growth increases because firms react to this increase in demand by producing more goods and services. There is more demand out there in the economy. There is a greater incentive for firms to produce more goods and services to meet that extra demand. Therefore, output in the economy increases. Therefore, there is an increase in real GDP. That's how you need to explain it. Learn that properly. Unemployment decreases. Unemployment and growth are very much linked together. Whatever happens to growth, you can then make a link to what's going to happen to unemployment. So whenever growth increases, unemployment falls. Because labour is a derived demand. Remember from my video on unemployment that labour is a derived demand. Derived from the demand for goods and services, which is what growth is. So when growth increases, there is greater demand for goods and services. When there is a greater demand for goods and services, there is a greater demand for labour to produce those goods and services. So therefore, the demand for labour increases, which then reduces unemployment. That's how you need to explain that. That is like properly awesome analysis. You say that, you're gonna sound amazing. You're gonna look amazing in your exam. Okay? So that's unemployment. Inflation falls because labour is a derived demand. Remember from my video on unemployment that labour is a derived demand. Derived from the demand for goods and services, which is what growth is. So when growth increases, there is greater demand for goods and services. When there is a greater demand for goods and services, there is a greater demand for labour to produce those goods and services. So therefore the demand for labour increases, which then reduces unemployment. That's how you need to explain that. That is like properly awesome analysis. You say that, you're gonna sound amazing. You're gonna look amazing in your exam. Okay? So that's unemployment. Inflation. It's no good just saying there is an increase in demand pull inflation. That's not good enough. Why is there an increase in demand pull inflation? Well, now as there is more demand in the economy, more growth, there is more pressure put on the existing factors of production in the economy. Therefore, the price of those factors of production is going to increase. So the existing factors of production might be land, it might be labour, capital. When there is more pressure put on labour, for example, more pressure put on labour, workers are going to demand higher wages. And that's going to increase prices, that's going to increase costs, that's going to increase inflation. So when we are close to full employment levels of output, there is more pressure put on the existing factors of production, which causes upward pressure on prices. thus increasing inflation in the economy. That's fine. And for trade position, the way you work out trade position, you go to inflation. Whatever's going on with inflation, you can make a link to exports. So here, inflation is increasing, which makes exports in the economy less competitive, therefore the demand for exports is likely to fall, therefore reducing exports in the economy and worsening the trade position. With aggregate demand, we can also make a link to imports. So as a result of the economy getting richer, of people in the economy getting richer, because the material living standard is going up, people are going to demand more stuff. They've got more incomes, they want more stuff now. So they're probably going to demand more imports, because a lot of that stuff can't be produced in the domestic economy. So when there is more growth in the economy, there is also more demand for imports, which again is going to reduce the current account position. That effect is much smaller, I would say, than the inflation one. So your primary place to go is the inflation impact, and that has probably the biggest weight, although so does, this is also quite a big effect as well. Right, let's do the same thing for long aggregate supply shift. So an aggregate supply shift to the right, what's going on? We'll have a look now. You pause the video now and have a go. What's going on to each of the 4 macro indicators and why? See if you can do that. Right, let's have a look, shall we? So what's going on with growth? You can see growth is increasing from Y1 to Y2. So yeah, there is an increase in growth. Happy days. What's going on with unemployment? Unemployment is falling. Hopefully now you can explain why. Inflation in the economy is falling. Great. And our trade position is actually improving. If you've gone to inflation to work that out, you're actually doing quite well there. So trade position improves. So the explanation, same reason for growth increasing. There is more demand now for goods and services. There is an extension of aggregate demand, isn't there? So there is more demand for goods and services. Firms respond to that by producing more output, which increases economic growth. When there is more growth, there is more demand for labour, because labour is a derived demand derived from the demand for goods and services. Therefore, when growth increases, the demand for labour increases, reducing unemployment. Perfect. Inflation, in this sense, it reduces because there is less competition for goods and services. So when aggregate supply shifts to the right, you need to explain the reduction in inflation in terms of reduced competition for goods and services. So now, because there is reduced competition for goods and services, overall that leads to reduced cost-push inflationary pressures, and trade position improves because now exports become relatively more competitive as the price level in the economy actually falls. That's to explain, okay? You do that, that is going to be properly amazing analysis. So if the question's asking about growth only, then you'd isolate the effect on growth. If the question's asking about growth and unemployment, you would isolate both of those. If the question's asking about national economic performance, or if it's about macroeconomic performance, you need to mention all 4. That's very important as well. So bear that in mind. The more you talk about, the better, as long as it's relevant to the question. You've also got your standard evaluation points down here, which we've mentioned over and over again in my previous videos. I hope that helps you with analysis. Make sure you nail that. Do that in depth and you'll be great. You'll be scoring high marks in the exam. All the best. See you next time. Thank you very much. Everybody, output gaps occur any time where the actual level of output is different from the potential level of output, i.e. it is not equal to the full employment level of output. Let's look at negative output gaps first. A negative output gap occurs any time where actual output is less than the potential level of output. This is also known as a deflationary gap and also known as a recessionary gap, because you tend to see this when the economy is suffering from a recession. Let's look at the classical interpretation and a Keynesian interpretation of what a negative output gap would look like. Well, in the classical model, let's draw AD and SRAS. So there's SRAS and there is AD. Now, where they meet is the actual level of output, right? And that is at Y1 with an inflation level, a price level at P1. But crucially, that output level is going to be less than the potential level of output. So LRAS is going to be to the right of this equilibrium. It's going to be over here somewhere. Okay, so there is LRAS, and there is YFE. Okay, so the distance, the difference between Y1 and YFE is the negative output gap, or the deflationary gap, or the recessionary gap, whatever you want to call it. There it is, right there. Actual level of output is less than the potential level of output. What about a Keynesian interpretation? Well, let's draw a Keynesian LRAS curve, which will look something like this. Okay, there is YFE, full employment, right there. So AD would cut LRAS any point below YFE, so maybe over here. So that's AD. Then there is the actual level of output, which is Y1, and there is the price level P1. So again, the difference between Y1 and YFE is the negative output gap, or the deflationary gap, or the recessionary gap. Actual level of output is less than the potential level of output. This is a negative output gap using a Keynesian LRAS diagram. What about a positive output gap? Where a positive output gap occurs where the actual level of output is greater than the potential level of output. Another name for this is an inflationary gap. How would classical economists show it? Well, let's show AD and SRAS again. So there is SRAS and there is AD. Okay, and where the two meet, we have the actual level of output, which is Y1, and we have a price level of P1. But crucially now, this output level is going to be greater than the potential level of output. So LRAS, we can draw it over here somewhere. And there is YFE. But you can see that the actual level of output is greater than the potential level of output. How is that possible? Well, remember what we said in previous videos. It is possible for a short period of time for the economy to be producing beyond the full employment level of output, because YFE represents the maximum level of output that an economy can produce using all factors of production at sustainable levels. Okay? So it is possible to produce beyond that. We said that the YFE value represents production that is taking place when the labour market is in full equilibrium, i.e. at the natural rate of unemployment. So to produce Y1, maybe we're taking workers out of the natural rate of unemployment. Maybe we are overusing labour, unsustainable use of labour. Maybe we're overusing capital, unsustainable use of capital, to produce Y1. The end result will be an overheating economy with probably very high inflation, hence the term inflationary gap is used as well as a positive output gap. It's very difficult to show it on a Keynesian diagram. In fact, it's impossible to show it perfectly according to this definition on a Keynesian diagram. But in case you wanted to show it, this is how you would do it. So again, a Keynesian LRAS curve, and you would just show aggregate demand right at the top of the vertical part of Keynesian LRAS, i.e. right at YFE with a very high price level there. Okay, now this doesn't fit the definition exactly, I know that, but it would still be accepted by an examiner. This is the only way you can show it, using a Keynesian interpretation here. But if you have to draw a positive output gap in the exam, don't draw the Keynesian version, draw the classical version, where what you're showing clearly fits the definition. This is output gaps. What's very interesting is how you can use the idea of output gaps when it comes to evaluating key ideas in your essays. Let's see how you can do that. Well, let's take an AD shift to the right. Maybe there's been an increase in real disposable income in the economy. When AD shifts to the right, what conclusions do we normally make? Well, we normally say, look, that the actual level of growth will increase. We say that because labour is a derived demand, unemployment will decrease. We say that there'll be a rise in demand pull inflation, and because of that, a worsening of the trade position as exports become less competitive. That's normally our conclusions, but we can evaluate that, we can critique that by using output gaps. Now what we can say is, what if there is such a huge negative output gap? Maybe the economy is in deep recession, where AD is way down here, at Y1, price level P1, a huge negative output gap, the difference between Y1 and YFE. Actual growth is much less than potential growth. Well, if there is an increase in real disposable income and AD shifts to the right, there is not necessarily going to be an increase in inflation at all. So if AD shifts to the right and we go here to AD2, you can see that, yes, we see the increase in actual growth, yes, we see the fall in unemployment, but we don't see any impact on inflation whatsoever. The price level remains at P1. However, you could say, if the economy was operating at full employment or very close to full employment, and AD were to shift to the right due to a rise in real disposable income, let's say, then you might start to see a conflict. So if AD shifted to AD3, for example, then alright, we get maybe an increase in economic growth, but with that, we see the conflict of higher inflation. And you can say if the economy is at full employment and AD shifts to the right, there'll be no impact on growth, no impact on unemployment, there'll only be inflationary pressure. So you can use output gaps to evaluate that way. You can use the same idea if you're shifting AD left as well. Very useful evaluation when you're talking about the conflict of macroeconomic objectives and whether there will be a conflict or not. Let's do the same thing for LRAS. Well, what conclusions do we make for LRAS? Well, we say that when LRAS shifts to the right, there'll be an increase in both actual and potential growth. There'll be a fall in unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment will decrease. We say that cost-push inflationary pressure will decrease, and with that, exports become more competitive, and maybe the trade position in the economy will improve too. We make all of these assumptions, whether you use the classical model to do it, whether you use the Keynesian model to do it, they are the conclusions we generally make. But that doesn't have to be the case, okay? Again, what if there is a huge negative output gap? What if AD is very, very low in the economy? Well, let's take the classical interpretation of that, okay? And let's say that maybe AD is over here, so that's AD, and there's LRAS. And with that, we have a price level P1, and there is YFP1. Well, what if LRAS shifts, but there isn't enough AD in the economy, there isn't enough demand in the economy to make any use of that shift of LRAS? So maybe LRAS shifts over here. Well, AD is not cutting the new LRAS curve, so there is going to be no change at all in the economy. Yeah? So if LRAS shifts without there being any aggregate demand out there in the economy to meet that new level of long-run aggregate supply, there is going to be no change to equilibrium whatsoever in the economy. Yeah? So all of the conclusions we came to are not going to take place. We can show exactly the same thing on a Keynesian LRAS diagram as well. So, you know, there's LRAS there, and there is YFE. But if AD is way down here, let's say, with equilibrium of Y1 and price level P1, what if LRAS shifts to over here, to LRAS2? Again, there isn't enough aggregate demand in the economy in the first place to make any use of that shift. Such a large negative output gap in the first place, whereby this shift of LRAS is redundant. Yeah? In this case, what is needed? Not LRAS shifting policies like supply-side policies, but demand-side policies, Keynes would argue, are needed to get aggregate demand closer to the full employment level of output. Supply-side policies in this case, when the economy is in deep recession with a huge negative output gap, are going to be useless. Demand-side policies are the only way in which the economy can grow. So this is how you can use output gaps to evaluate the key conclusions that we come to whenever we shift AD or LRAS. Whenever we talk about the impacts on macroeconomic performance, output gaps are always a fantastic evaluation tool for you to use. So hope that makes sense. Hopefully now you can really nail the essays when you use output gaps. I will catch you all in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.
Just nu pågår Green Friday. Vårens största shoppingdag fortsätter hela helgen på cdon.com med riktigt schyssta priser på skönhet.
Fiscal policies are policies implemented by government to try and manipulate the level of aggregate demand in the economy first and foremost. It's a demand-side policy, but it can also have an effect on the supply side of the economy too. So fiscal policy are decisions by the government to either increase or decrease government spending and to increase or decrease taxation. Decisions about government spending and taxation are what fiscal policy is all about. So like I said, initially it's there to manage the demand of the economy, the level of aggregate demand in the economy, whilst also maybe having an effect on supply. So let's take the effect on aggregate demand first. What fiscal policies might affect aggregate demand? Well, very obviously, an increase in government spending or a reduction in taxation. So a reduction in income tax, a reduction in corporation tax, a reduction in indirect taxes like VAT, all will increase aggregate demand, as will any increase in government spending on whatever it might be, on anything the government might want to choose to spend on. It will increase aggregate demand. And by increasing aggregate demand, there'll be an increase in growth in the economy. So if the economy is initially way down here in recession, you can expect to see what we call expansionary fiscal policies. Expansionary fiscal policies are any fiscal policy that leads to an increase in aggregate demand. So reduction in taxation or an increase in government spending. So in recession, we expect to see expansionary fiscal policies to move us away from recession towards the full employment level of output, increasing actual growth. So when there is an increase in aggregate demand, there'll be an increase in actual growth, a reduction in unemployment, an increase in demand for inflationary pressure, and maybe a worsening of the current account position, the balance of payments. So that might happen on the one side. So whenever you hear in your exam, the government decides to increase the budget deficit, whenever you see something like that, that means aggregate demand is likely to increase. A worsening of the budget deficit means government spending is more than taxation, and now even more than taxation, which means that either government spending has increased or taxation has fallen, or both, so aggregate demand will shift to the right. But if we look at number 2, either of these two things, so that could be an increase again in government spending, or a reduction in taxation, could also increase long-run aggregate supply. If we're more specific now, so instead of just saying increase in government spending, let's say it was an increase in government spending to improve education and training. Well, if that was the case, that's going to improve the quality of labour, and therefore long-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. If it was a reduction in corporation tax, maybe, now that firms have got more retained profits, they're more likely to invest, in which case the quality and quantity of capital will increase, therefore long-run aggregate supply will increase. So, yes, an increase in government spending, reduction in taxation will in the short term increase aggregate demand, but there is also a long-term aggregate supply impact here, when the quantity and quality of factors of production can change too, and aggregate supply can shift to the right as a result. So bear that in mind, there are dual effects with fiscal policy, primarily yes a demand side policy, but also potentially aggregate supply affecting too.
I shot right in the middle of
So let's look at the exam side of things, the evaluation side of things. Well, on the one hand, why is fiscal policy good? Well, it can affect C, I, and G. It can affect consumption. If taxation falls, consumption might increase because consumers have got more money in their pockets now. The dual effects on AD and AS, as we've seen. And there was also a benefit from fiscal policy via automatic stabilizers. If you don't understand what that means, watch my video on automatic stabilizers to understand. But there are also some problems here. You can see that initially it is a demand side policy first and foremost. When there is an expansionary fiscal policy, an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxation, and aggregate demand shifts to the right, there will be an increase in demand pull inflationary pressure. Of course, we might see contractionary fiscal policy, where there is a fall in government spending and a rise in taxation, in which case there will be a decrease in demand pull inflationary pressure. But if we're assuming expansionary fiscal policy, this one, number 1, is a key problem. There's a time lag. So when the government decides to spend, when it decides to change tax, there is a time lag before we see an effect on the macroeconomy. So there is a time lag before the real effect of the policy takes place. There may be disincentive effects as a result, especially of taxation policies. So for contractionary fiscal policies, let's say the government decides to increase income tax. Well, if by doing that, it disincentivizes people to work, and therefore increases unemployment, or it reduces the size of the labour force, thus reducing LRES, that's a huge disincentive effect. So there might be some disincentive effects there as well. There might be some forms of government spending which are inflexible. So if the government wanted to reduce government spending, it might find that very hard to do. If it spent lots of money on hospitals, building hospitals and schools, if these projects are only half completed, you can't just reduce the spending on them. It's ridiculous. So some forms of government spending may be inflexible, reducing the impact of contractionary fiscal policies. Reaction to the policies may not be as expected. So just because you reduce taxes doesn't mean people are going to spend more, doesn't mean firms are going to invest. So reactions might not be as expected. And finally, if these policies, expansionary fiscal policies, are financed via borrowing money, the government borrows lots of money to pay for these projects, well, how are the government going to pay for these? How's the government going to finance that borrowing? Is it going to raise taxes in the future? Probably. In which case, future generations are going to be burdened by this. So the impact is that expansionary fiscal policies are going to make the budget deficit worse. It's going to add to the national debt of the government. And that's not good for the future generations. It's not sustainable. It's not a sustainable way of allowing the economy to grow. So that's another issue there. So overall, let's look at expansionary fiscal policy. Whether expansionary fiscal policy is going to be effective in increasing growth and reducing unemployment depends on the initial level of economic activity. Key thing. Let's say we were initially here at 82. If we implemented expansionary fiscal policy, yes, AD might increase, but it wouldn't lead to a very much increase in growth, and it wouldn't reduce unemployment very much either. because the initial level of economic activity is already very, very high. We're very close to full employment. So the closer we are to full employment, the less the effect of the fiscal policy will be, whereas the further away we are from full employment, the more spare capacity there is, the greater the effect on growth and unemployment. Depends on the size of the multiplier. The bigger the size of the multiplier, the less that government needs to spend money for there to be a very large impact on growth. Because an initial round of spending, an initial round of government spending, will lead to further rounds of spending and further rounds of spending and further rounds of spending, which means the end effect on aggregate demand will be very large, much larger than the initial increase in spending. So the bigger the size of the multiplier, the less that government spending needs to increase for there to be a large increase in growth and a large decrease in unemployment. Depends on the size of the time lag. Obviously, the bigger the time lag, the less the effect will be in the short term, and depends on whether expansionary fiscal policy might be offset by other factors, by other policies. Maybe there are, at the same time of expansionary fiscal policy, maybe there's contractionary monetary policy, which offsets this. Maybe there is a rise in the exchange rate, which might offset the increase in aggregate demand. So there you go, a whole essay pro forma there for you. I hope that helps. See you next time. Thank you. Automatic stabilizers are something the government can kind of fall back on to negate the fluctuations in economic growth, to negate the size of the fluctuations in the business cycle. How does it work? Well, what I've drawn here is the economic cycle for you, something that you should all be familiar with. If not, watch my video on the economic cycle to fully understand it. You know there are peaks and troughs, there are booms and there are recessions in the economic cycle. The beauty of automatic stabilizers is that it's a part of fiscal policy that's automatic, that doesn't need to be actively changed by government. So let's have a look. Let's take a recession, for example. So, in recession, if we focus in on what's going on in the labour market, it gives us an idea of what's going on with government spending and taxation. So in the kind of the heart of a recession, the worst of the recession, there is a lot of unemployment in the economy, a lot of spare capacity, there aren't many people in work. So, if we isolate what's going on there in terms of the fiscal effects, then in recession, government spending naturally is going to rise. The government spending specifically on benefits will rise, and more people are unemployed. The government needs to spend more on benefits. So automatically, government spending will rise. Similarly, automatically, taxation, in terms of tax revenue collected by the government, is going to fall in recession because there are less people in work. So less people in work, they're going to pay less income tax, obviously. At the same time, businesses are not going to be making as many profits. They are not going to be as confident in terms of investment. So overall, business profits are going to fall, and therefore the level of corporation tax collected by government is also going to fall. So government spending on benefits will rise, tax revenue collected is going to fall. So automatically, these factors are going to some extent, allow aggregate demand to increase. Without the government actively getting involved at all, there are some benefits here from the automatic stabilizers. Let's do the same for a boom. In a boom time, isolate the labour market. What's happening in the labour market? Well, there are lots and lots of people in work. It's actually very hard to find excess labour now because simply everyone is in a job. Everyone's got a job. So in that sense, government spending on benefits actually decreases. They don't need to spend as much on benefits because people have got jobs. And at the same time, the tax revenue collected increases because more people are in work, they pay more income tax. Firms achieve higher profits, they get higher revenues, which means they're going to pay more corporation tax as a result during a boom time. So these two things are therefore going to reduce aggregate demand and automatically stabilize the economy and prevent the economy from growing too quickly in a boom period. So the point of automatic stabilizers is they reduce the overall fluctuations in the business cycle. They allow the economy to transition on a smooth path of growth rather than suffering these big fluctuations in actual growth. So whereas in the red line, that's what might actually happen. With automatic stabilizers as a result, the actual red line, the size of the deviations from the trend rate of growth actually minimizes. So if I do it in black, what we actually see is actual growth not deviating from trend growth as much because the automatic stabilizers reduce the depth of the recession via an automatic increase in aggregate demand because of these factors. And in a boom time, the level of growth automatically kind of stabilizes, it decreases because of the automatic reduction in aggregate demand slightly because of contractionary effects from the fiscal policies here. They're not really policies, but from the negative effects of the automatic stabilizers. So bear that in mind. Automatic stabilizers stabilize the economy automatically without any need for active fiscal policy. But of course, the effects of these can be quite small. So active fiscal policy via these forms in recession and these forms in a boom may still be necessary to actually reduce the overall effects of the recession and to reduce the rampant inflation and rampant growth caused by a boom period. I hope that all makes sense with automatic stabilizers. See you next time. Thank you.
Ja, det ryktades om det redan när den låg på trackslistan. Men Uggla ville...
Monetary policy is another type of demand-side policy, which has got three branches to it. Monetary policy can involve manipulating interest rates, it can involve manipulating the money supply in the economy, and it can involve manipulating the exchange rate in the economy. All three branches you need to know and need to understand, but especially interest rates. Interest rates is the big daddy of monetary policy. Demand-side policy, yes, but as fiscal policy, it also has got an aggregate supply link. So, when we consider monetary policy, we can have, again, expansionary monetary policy, and we can have contractionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy is any monetary policy that increases aggregate demand, whereas contractionary policy is any monetary policy that reduces aggregate demand. So a reduction in interest rates, an increase in the money supply, a
Hello, Orange. Orange.
Let's have at it, mates. Orange. Grenade. Flashbang.
Bomb there.
Decoys out.
Last buff. B. Hello, Orange.
Counter-terrorists win.
Thanks, mate.
Deploying decoy. Move it, move it. Decoy. Smoke. Throwing a grenade. Grenade. Deploying flashbang. Throwing smoke.
the exchange rate. All will increase aggregate demand. All will shift it to the right. They are all examples of expansionary monetary policy. Vice versa would be examples of contractionary fiscal policy. So let's isolate interest rates because they very much are the big daddy. We'll also look at money supply and exchange rate. But interest rates, very simply defined as the cost of borrowing. Interest rates are very simply the price of money, the cost of borrowing money and the rate of return on savings. So when interest rates are reduced, the cost of borrowing reduces and the rate of return on saving decreases as well. You need to be able to start by explaining that. You need to show your understanding what interest rates mean. When interest rates fall, these two things happen. There is a double-edged coin when it comes to interest rates. Yes, they affect the cost of borrowing, but it also affects the rate of return on saving. You must mention both of those in your exam to score, otherwise you're not going to score fully, alright? But interest rates affect so many different things. Interest rates can affect the demand for loans. A reduction in interest rates will increase the demand for loans because it's now cheaper to borrow money, increasing the demand for loans. A reduction in interest rates will reduce the incentive to save because now the rate of return on saving reduces. So people are going to think, well, why save my money if I'm not going to get much interest on it? I'd rather just spend it instead. It affects discretionary income. Discretionary income is just the income left after your taxes and after your key bills. So your discretionary income, if you have a mortgage, is affected by interest rates. So during the deep recession in 2008 to 2010, interest rates were at 0.5% for a long, long period of time. And those with mortgages benefited massively because the interest rates that they had to pay on their mortgage, the interest repayments plummeted, which meant that they actually had more income each month. So it affects them too. It affects the real incomes of those with savings. So if interest rates fall again, people with savings are going to get less of a return, which reduces their overall incomes. It affects the demand for housing, because as we know, most people buy houses in the UK anyway, and in most major Western economies, they buy houses by taking out a mortgage, taking out a loan on the house. And what they do each month, they pay back interest they pay back interest each month that actually pays back the mortgage. So if interest rates are very low, it's going to potentially increase the demand for houses because now the interest repayment on mortgages is actually very low. So it incentivizes people to buy houses, which increases the demand for houses, increases house prices. So there's another impact on low interest rates. But it also will affect the exchange rate. If you don't understand now, watch my video on exchange rate changes for you to understand how interest rates can also affect the exchange rate. Very simply, whatever happens to interest rates, the same will happen to the exchange rate. So if interest rates fall, the exchange rate is also going to fall. The simple reason is because hot money flows. Hot money will leave the economy, in this case let's say the UK, and therefore the value of the pound is going to depreciate. The supply of the pound increases. So exchange rate will also change, and when the exchange rate changes, the effect on the trade performance will also, in this case, improve if the exchange rate weakens. Net exports will increase, therefore increase in aggregate demand. If you don't understand that, watch my video on exchange rate impacts to fully understand, okay? Right, so expansionary monetary policy are any monetary policies that will increase aggregate demand. So it could be a reduction in interest rates will shift aggregate demand to the right. It might be an increase in the money supply, MS. An increase in the money supply will also increase aggregate demand, shifting it to the right. It might be a reduction in the exchange rate. It's hard to manipulate the exchange rate. So manipulating the exchange rate is very much a minor branch of monetary policy. But in theory anyway, by reducing the exchange rate, maybe by reducing interest rates, maybe by the government actually meddling in the foreign exchange market, even though governments these days don't have much control over monetary policy. If they did, they could meddle in the foreign exchange market and actually allow their exchange rate to fall, increase the supply of their currency by buying more foreign currencies, causing the exchange rate to depreciate. But really these two are the big ones, interest rates and money supply. And these are all examples of expansionary monetary policy where aggregate demand will shift to the right. Contractionary monetary policy is any monetary policy that will shift it to the left. So the opposite of these will shift it to the left and contract the economy, will reduce growth and increase unemployment. In this case, with expansionary monetary policy, growth increases, unemployment falls, there is some demand pull inflationary pressure as well, which might, as a result, worsen the current account position of the balance of payments. There is also a long-run aggregate supply impact. So yes, this is a demand-side policy, but there is also a supply-side impact here because a reduction in interest rates can also increase investment. In fact, that's something I missed out here, all the demand for loans. But firms also are impacted by lower interest rates. Their cost of borrowing for them falls, so they're more likely to borrow money to fund investment projects. If firms do that, they borrow money and they pour that money into the purchase of capital goods, that's going to increase investment. And an increase in investment, yes, will increase aggregate demand in the short run, but will also increase aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, as the quantity and quality of capital improves. So when interest rates fall, you can expect there to be an increase in investment too, which will increase long-run aggregate supply. So don't forget the dual effect. You've got an increase in aggregate demand, yes, from a reduction in interest rates, but also an increase in long-run aggregate supply because of an increase in investment. Do not forget the dual effect. One final point I want to say is that central banks tend to be in charge of monetary policy around the world. Central banks like the Bank of Japan, the Federal Reserve in America, the European Central Bank in the Eurozone, the Bank of England in the UK. These central banks are the people that control what happens to monetary policy. This tends not to be in government control. Fiscal policy, yes it is, but monetary policy, no. It's in the hands of central banks. And within central banks you have got committees who decide what's going to happen to interest rates. So the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England in the UK decide what's going to happen to interest rates each month. They don't just decide willy-nilly. They don't just say, 1 month, it'll be great if interest rates fall, it'll be great if interest rates rise or whatever. No, that's just completely bogus. They actually target inflation when they set interest rates. So in the UK, the target rate of inflation is 2%. So what the Monetary Policy Committee do is when they feel inflation is getting out of control, maybe it's getting too high, like 5% or something, they can increase interest rates, reduce the level of aggregate demand in the economy and reduce inflation. And if inflation is too low, they can reduce interest rates, increase aggregate demand and cause more inflation to get inflation back to target. So they target inflation. And there are two main benefits of inflation targeting which you need to know as well. One is that it keeps inflation expectations under control, which means that random consumer consumption habits are not going to cause sharp changes in inflation. So if you keep a check on inflation expectations, consumers won't bring forward consumption expecting large increases in inflation. Therefore, inflation will always be kept under control. So inflation expectations keeps a lid on big changes in consumption, which we don't want to see. And at the same time, another benefit is that by targeting inflation and by people expecting inflation to be low, it allows the central bank to keep interest rates low. So if they manage to successfully target inflation, it means they've got more reason to keep interest rates down, which therefore will stimulate aggregate demand in the economy, maybe aggregate supply as well, which is good for the economy too. So there's monetary policy. My next video is going to look at the evaluation of monetary policy. Pay attention in that to get the full essay plan. Thanks very much. See you then. Okay, let's now evaluate monetary policy and say whether really it's any good or not. There are benefits, there are problems, and really overall whether monetary policy is going to be effective or not depends on several points. So this is essentially a big essay plan for you without all the theory that we learned in the previous video and the diagrams. So, the benefits of monetary policy, well first of all, it affects in the aggregate demand equation consumption, investment, and then exports. It's got a massive effect on all of these things. So that's great. It's got various avenues in which growth can actually increase. At the same time, if there is a positive multiplier in the economy, you can expect further gains in aggregate demand too. Further increases in growth, further reductions in unemployment than you initially thought. There are dual impacts on AD and AS, as we said in the previous video. Yes, from aggregate demand from here, but also an increase in investment, increase in the quantity and quality of capital. So therefore, long-run aggregate supply increases, the productive capacity of the economy increases, which is good. But there are some issues with monetary policy too. It can lead to demand pull inflation. So when aggregate demand increases, there is demand pull inflationary pressure. More worryingly, if let's say aggregate demand is to be boosted by an increase in the money supply, let's say that's the monetary policy, well, if that's not controlled, that can lead to rampant inflation, uncontrollable inflation, rampant inflation, which is not good. So there is a big risk of demand pull inflation. There is a time lag involved with monetary policy, especially with interest rates. When interest rates change, it needs to go through what's known as the transmission mechanism, which you don't really need to know in detail at AS level. But there is a whole series of channels that interest rates need to feed down before they actually get into the macroeconomy fully. And economists believe that the length of time before interest rates feed through fully into the macroeconomy is 18 months because of the size of the transmission mechanism and the time it takes to feed through these different avenues I've just talked about. So there is a time lag involved with monetary policy, which is why central bankers and those that are in charge of setting interest rates tend to look forward because interest rates are really going to only have the full effect after 18 months. At the same time, reactions by consumers and firms may not be as expected. So just because you reduce interest rates, it doesn't mean people are going to spend. You can't force people to spend money. People might react differently. People might be worried about their job prospects. People might not actually understand what a reduction in interest rates mean. People might not respond as you would expect for a whole host of reasons which can negate the impact. And we never would have said this really before the 2008 massive financial crisis, but interest rates can't fall below zero. Who would have thought that that's a problem? It's turned out to be a huge problem. So interest rates have a limit. You can't keep cutting interest rates. Eventually you get to a stage where you can't cut anymore. And that's been a huge problem with advanced economies in the West and in Japan as well, who have seen a limit of interest rates as a policy and therefore have implemented other types of monetary policy like quantitative easing, increasing the money supply, to try and fuel growth from monetary policy. And overall, whether expansionary monetary policy, let's say, actually works in stimulating aggregate demand, in stimulating growth and reducing unemployment depends on, number one, the key thing, the initial level of economic activity. If the initial level of economic activity is close to the full employment level of output, then an increase in aggregate demand won't necessarily increase growth. It won't necessarily reduce unemployment because the economy is already very close to utilising all of its factors of production. Therefore, it can't produce any more. So all we're going to see, if the initial level of economic activity is very close to full employment, all we're going to see is a big increase in inflation because of the pressure on these factors of production. So that's an important factor to consider. A good diagram is needed here to explain that in an exam. Also depends on the level of confidence. Wow, what a point this is. This is massive. Huge, huge point. Anytime you talk about interest rates and their effect, you bring in confidence because it's massive. In the peak of the 2008-2010 recession, the level of consumer confidence and business confidence was so low, so damn low, that even though interest rates fell from about 5.5% to 0.5%, there was pretty much no impact on consumption at all. People just didn't want to borrow. They were so worried about their job prospects. They were so worried about the state of the economy, and businesses were so worried about future demand and revenue and profit, that they just didn't want to borrow money at all, regardless of how much interest rates fell. So in that sense, the level of confidence is fundamental. We can't just say when interest rates fall, consumers will borrow. It's heavily dependent on confidence. Which is why interest rates had pretty much no effect in 2008, in the 2008 recession, which is why we saw a big new policy introduced, quantitative easing, an increase in the money supply. Because interest rates lost their effectiveness, the central banks needed to find a different method of trying to increase aggregate demand, knowing that consumers just didn't have any confidence and businesses had no confidence. So number two is a huge point. Anytime we talk about interest rates, talk about yes, number one, but also number two, confidence is key. The size of the multiplier, the bigger the multiplier, the less interest rates need to be cut for there to be a large increase in growth and a large reduction in unemployment. Depends on the level of the change. The bigger the change, of course, the bigger the end effect will be on aggregate demand. Consumers will see a large fall in the cost of borrowing and therefore are going to be more incentivized to borrow money as it's cheaper and less incentivized to save, therefore they're going to borrow and spend. And also depends on whether expansionary monetary policy might be offset by other factors, maybe offset by contractionary fiscal policy, in which case that might reduce aggregate demand and reduce the gains that we might have seen otherwise from expansionary policy. Or maybe some other factors might have reduced the effect of expansionary policy too, something else that might have reduced aggregate demand. So bear all that in mind, that's a perfect essay plan for you now to tackle monetary policy in an exam. Hope that helps. See you next time. Thank you very much. Hi everyone. Let's now move away from demand-side policies like monetary and fiscal policy. Let's focus on supply-side policies, which aim to increase the productive potential of the economy, Not to do with demand now, to do with aggregate supply, to increase the productive potential of the economy, basically to increase aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply in the economy. Shift it right. That's the intention here. By doing so, we must be increasing the quantity and quality of our factors of production, capital, enterprise, land and labour, or we're increasing the overall efficiency of markets. So that bullet point there is very important. That's why aggregate supply can shift to the right. So make sure that one is fixed in your head. Supply side policies can be interventionist. They can actually promote the role of government in the economy, or they can be free market promoting. They can promote less government in the economy and markets to work more freely. If they're interventionist, they tend to start with either government spending or reduced taxation. So there can be dual effects as well. There can be an effect on aggregate demand in the short term as well. But the main intention here is to increase aggregate supply, increase the productive potential of the economy, the maximum amount an economy can produce. On a diagram, the intention looks like this. We're trying to shift aggregate supply to the right. In doing so, we're going to see an increase in the productive potential of the economy. YFE has increased from down here to now over here. The economy can produce more, potentially, but also actual growth will increase. Y1 goes to Y2, and that's going to reduce unemployment in the economy. Inflation is going to fall, cost-push inflation more specifically is going to fall, and therefore there is likely to be an improvement in the current account position. There's going to be an increase in exports, which is going to improve our trade position. So all four key macro objectives of government are likely to improve. So supply-side policies from the offset look like a perfect policy in achieving the main macro objectives of government, which is great, and this diagram tells you that. So what are the policies? What are the supply-side policies that can be used to do this? Well, the way I teach this to my students is I say, the target of supply-side policies is life. And what we're trying to do with life is to make it epic. Just like in real life, we're trying to make our lives as epic as possible. Well, supply-side policies try and do exactly the same thing. They try and make life epic. What the heck do I mean by that? Well, life is the target of supply-side policies. Labour markets, industry, firms, basically. Free markets. And with free markets, we're trying to make free markets more efficient. So the F and the E go together. So they're the target, life is the target, and we're trying to make life epic. So when we know what we're targeting, we're either trying to make these markets more efficient, we're trying to make them more productive, we're trying to provide incentives, we're trying to increase competition. So we start with life, that's our target, and then we look at epic to know what we're trying to do to these markets. So let's take some examples. So let's look at labour markets first. Supply-side policies targeting labour markets. Well, a supply-side policy might be to improve education and training. Where does that lead us in EPIC? Well, that increases the productivity of labour. By improving education and training, workers will be more productive, therefore the quality of labour increases, thus increasing aggregate supply. So we go from our target to EPIC to then this major bullet point here. Either we increase the quantity and quality of factors of production, in this case it was quality of labour, or we look at improving the efficiency of markets. So that's the way we go, right, like that. What about the reduction in income tax? A reduction in income tax provides an incentive for potential workers to enter the labour force, thus increasing the quantity of labour. See the little circle we're doing there? The next two are all about increasing the efficiency of the market. So abolishing the minimum wage or reducing trade union power. Both of those reduce the costs of production for firms. The reason why? It's argued that minimum wages and strong trade unions fix wages in the labour market above the equilibrium wage rate, which causes an excess supply, which causes inefficiencies, basically. So by abolishing the minimum wage, by reducing the strength of trade unions, we can bring wages back down to equilibrium wage rates in the economy, which then reduces cost of production for firms, which makes the labour market more efficient, which then increases the productive capacity of the economy in doing so. So that was all about improving the efficiency of the labour market. Another target of labour markets is we can actually reduce unemployment benefits, which incentivises employment. What about industry? How can we target industry? Well, governments can reduce corporation tax. That's a supply-side policy. Reducing corporation tax, again, reduces the cost of production for firms. It gives them more retained profits, which they might be able to use for investment. When firms invest, they buy capital goods, which increases the quantity and quality of capital. So this provides an incentive for firms to increase the quantity and quality of capital. Governments could provide subsidies to firms to promote research and development. Well, that's an incentive now given to firms to innovate new products, to advance technology, basically to engage in research and development as costs of production fall, as they have now basically more money. And that can increase the quantity and quality of capital as well, thus increasing aggregate supply, increasing the productive potential of the economy. But we could also see free market promoting supply-side policies, like privatization and deregulation. Let's take privatization first. Privatization can work twofold. Privatization is when the government allows the private sector to run certain organizations. It allows for more private sector activity, which means now there is a profit motive because the private sector gets involved, means they're striving for maximum profits. But it also means that there is a greater incentive for competition. So privatization provides an incentive for more competition to occur in the market, and because of the profit motive that now exists, there is a strive for greater efficiency. So as a result, there is going to be more efficiency in markets, there is going to be an increase in aggregate supply as a result of more firms entering the market, and a greater striving for more profit, which is going to bring down costs, which is going to increase efficiency. Deregulation as well. By deregulating, by reducing the level of regulation in the market, that again is going to incentivize new firms to enter the market, incentivize competition. When new firms enter, there's going to be a greater striving for more efficiency. When new firms enter, you want to try and get ahead of them. You're going to cut costs, you're going to try and be as efficient as possible, which is again going to increase the productive potential of the economy. So that one is improving the efficiency of markets. So these two are very much linked to efficiency, by promoting competition there. Alright, I hope now you understand how supply-side policies work. There can be an aggregate demand-side impact as well, but the main impact is that we're trying to increase aggregate supply. And by learning life and EPIC, you're going to get to the main idea of increasing quantity and quality of factors of production and increasing efficiency. I hope that all makes sense now. Learn that very well. You should all master supply-side policies. See you next time. Right, having understood supply-side policies, let's evaluate them. Let's see what's good, what's bad, and what the overall effect depends on. So supply-side policies, at least in theory, improve all the government's macroeconomic objectives. They promote higher growth, higher actual growth, and higher potential growth, which is great. They reduce unemployment, they reduce inflation in the economy, and they improve the trade position, which is all great. They also stimulate aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Most of the policies start with an increase in government spending to improve education and training. In my previous video, I didn't actually write all of that out, but you can see from those policies, most of them involve an increase in government spending or a reduction in tax, both of which will also increase short-term economic growth, which will increase aggregate demand. So although the intention is to increase aggregate supply, there will be an improvement in aggregate demand as well, which is a great thing. So you're going to see an increase in actual growth and an increase in potential growth. Whoop-de-doo, it's amazing. At the same time, supply-side policies are sustainable. They're non-inflationary. So one of the main drawbacks with demand-side policies is that, well, they're not really sustainable. You can't do them forever, because you get to a point where inflation will just be rampant. Whereas supply-side policies, they are sustainable. You can do them forever, as long as you want. You're not going to suffer from increases in inflation. They are non-inflationary policies. So that's very, very good. But there are drawbacks. Like I said in the last video, nothing is perfect in economics. There are always some problems. And these are the problems with supply-side policies. One, they're very, very expensive. Whoa. I don't want to underestimate here. I don't want to understate. They are properly expensive. We're talking in the billions of pounds for some of these policies. So, very expensive. And anytime we talk about expense in economics, we can bring in the opportunity cost argument. So, because they're so expensive, they cost so much for the government, there is a massive opportunity cost. Could that money have best been used elsewhere? To maybe improve police services, to improve in the allocation of merit goods, to improve maybe education and healthcare instead, or something, I don't know. Could it have been used elsewhere? That's the question that we need to ask. There is an opportunity cost here. At the same time, where does that money come from? Has it been borrowed? In which case, maybe there are going to be burdens on future generations. Has it come away from the provision of merit goods or something, in which case, was that actually a good decision or not? So there's a lot to analyse in the first point there. They take a long time to work. Let's take one example. Let's take the improvement in education and training. Well, if the government decides to reform the education system, to try and reform public examinations, it might take 15 years before there is an effect on the productivity of people, before there is an effect on the improvement in education of the ordinary working folk. So it might take a very, very long time to actually see an effect of such supply-side policies. Some supply-side policies take a lot longer to work than others do. Add to that, there is no guarantee they actually will work. Sounds great in theory, all those policies we talked about, but no guarantee they're going to work at all. Who's to say that when you cut corporation tax, businesses will invest? Who's to say that when you provide subsidies to firms, that they are going to use that money to get themselves involved in research and development? Who's to say they're going to do it? They might actually just give that money to shareholders instead. There's no guarantee that these policies will work in the way that they are intended to work. At the same time, they might be, in fact they will be ineffective if there is a lot of spare capacity in the economy. Picture the diagram in your head. When there is loads of spare capacity, what's needed is an increase in demand, not an increase in aggregate supply. The problem with a large amount of spare capacity is that by imposing supply-side policies, there is not going to be an improvement in actual growth at all. In fact, nothing will go on in the economy. All that will improve is that there will be more factors of production. It doesn't necessarily mean that there will be an increase in actual growth. So when we look at the depends on point, for supply-side policies to be effective, the economy must be reasonably close to full employment levels of output. Otherwise, what's the point of increasing aggregate supply? What's the point of increasing potential output when what's needed in the economy is an increase in actual output? So that's an important evaluation point to develop in your exam. If we're in deep recession, for example, we need a boost in demand. We don't need a boost in aggregate supply. So the level of economic activity is important in determining whether supply-side policies are needed or demand-side policies are needed to work immediately in the short term. I hope that helps with answering your question on supply-side policies. A great question if it comes up for you to ace. All the best. I'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Right, so having understood all the policies available to government, let's understand how the government can actually promote economic growth in the short run and in the long run. Remember, there are two different types of growth. If you don't understand that, watch my video on causes of economic growth. So in the short run, let's say they want to increase short-term growth. They want to increase growth immediately. In which case, what's needed is an increase in aggregate demand. And that can occur from various sources. So maybe that can occur from expansionary monetary or fiscal policy. Let's have some examples. Expansionary fiscal policy, maybe an increase in government spending, maybe a reduction in taxation, a reduction in income tax, a reduction in corporation tax, whatever it might be. Or maybe expansionary monetary policy, a reduction in interest rates, a reduction in the exchange rate, an increase in the money supply. All of which will increase aggregate demand as shown with this diagram. And you can see when aggregate demand shifts, actual growth increases from Y1 to Y2. That's the intention, an increase in actual short-term economic growth. Another benefit of these policies is, as we've learnt already, there can be a dual effect on aggregate supply as well. So that's an extra benefit that we might see at the same time. But there are some problems. You can see on this diagram that there is some demand pull inflation from P1 to P2 as a result of aggregate demand increasing. And there is no guarantee that these policies will actually work. They depend on lots of different factors. So whether growth increases depends on the initial level of economic activity. I've drawn my AD1 where there is quite a bit of spare capacity in the economy. If there wasn't much spare capacity, an increase in aggregate demand might not increase economic growth because we don't have enough factors of production available in the economy to actually produce more. So it depends on the initial level of economic activity. The more spare capacity, the greater chance that an increase in aggregate demand will increase growth. Depends on consumer confidence. If that's low, growth may not increase as expected. So anytime you're talking about consumption increasing, if that's what's underpinning your AD shift, well then you can always bring in the consumer confidence argument. Depends on the size of the multiplier. The bigger the multiplier, the less that the expansionary policy needs to actually be implemented. So the less that government spending needs to increase, the less that taxation needs to fall, etc. And also depends on the length of time. So some evaluation points there. For long-run growth, we're looking at supply-side policies, a whole host of which you can find on my video on supply-side policies. So any supply-side policies that will shift long-run aggregate supply to the right, you can see on this diagram that happening. As a result, there is an increase in potential growth, yes, But the way I draw my aggregate demand, there is also an increase in actual growth from Y1 to Y2. So that's going to do it, but that's going to be a long-term policy, a long-run effect there. Another benefit, often supply-side policies start with either government spending or reduced taxation, in which case there will be an increase in aggregate demand at the same time. So benefits, again, dual effects, but long time, they take a long time to work. There's no guarantee that they will work. They're very costly, they carry large opportunity costs, and whether they work or not in stimulating growth depends on the initial level of economic activity again. In this case, the more spare capacity, the more an increase in aggregate demand is needed, not an increase in aggregate supply. So if my AD was way down here, if I drew it on, if my AD was way down there, then increasing long-run aggregate supply does not change the level of growth. The level of growth is still going to be down here. So for these policies to work, we need to be quite close to a full employment level of output. So short-run growth policies, demand-side policies, expansionary monetary or expansionary fiscal policies, whereas long-run growth, we're looking at supply-side policies, both of which have got their problems. That's policies to promote economic growth. Thanks very much. See you next time. Right, let's now look at policies to reduce unemployment in the economy. Again, this is a big macroeconomic objective of government. So, for government to actually reduce unemployment, it first needs to know what type of unemployment is being caused. It might be a whole range, in which case a range of policies is necessary. But if there is one overriding type of unemployment, there may be a specific policy targeting that type, and reducing that type of unemployment is necessary. So we need to understand for different types of unemployment what policies are necessary. Let's take cyclical unemployment first, where there is a deficiency in demand. Well, if that's the case, if that's causing unemployment, then very simply a policy that is needed is one which increases aggregate demand. So expansionary monetary or fiscal policies will do the trick. So for fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy could be increase government spending or reduce taxation. For monetary policy, reduce interest rates, increase money supply or reduce the exchange rate. All will increase aggregate demand and therefore reduce cyclical unemployment. But there are problems with that. There'll be a conflict with another macro objective, which is inflation. When aggregate demand increases, you tend to see an increase in demand pull inflation, which may conflict with the government's inflation target. And at the same time, whether these policies work or not depend on the same factors as always: the initial level of economic activity, the level of consumer confidence, the size of the multiplier, whether it's been offset by other factors, etc. If there is a lot of structural unemployment in the economy, more specific supply-side problems are needed. The supply-side policies are needed because structural unemployment comes from the supply side, really. We know from my previous video on unemployment that within structural unemployment we have two specific problems. We have the occupational immobility of labour and the geographical immobility of labour. So policies are needed to target these types of immobility. So let's say there was a lot of occupational immobility of labour, in which case policies are needed that improves the mobility of labour, that improves people's skills, that makes it easier for people to find jobs, given the skills that they now have. So that might be the government's actually investing in worker training to improve the productivity of workers, yes, but more than that, simply just to give workers skills, which allows them to then transfer and to find jobs. It means that they're not going to be unemployed because they don't have skills anymore. It might be to make it easier for firms to actually hire workers. So that might include reduce the regulation when it comes to employing workers. Therefore, firms are going to be more likely to employ workers, and therefore workers are going to get skills. The problem with occupational mobility is that it can be very long-term, it can be very destructive. So if you provide an incentive for firms to actually hire workers, then suddenly there is a chance for workers to gain skills on the job. Otherwise, why are they going to have the chance to gain skills? They need to actually get in work to do so. So by removing regulation, which makes it easier for firms to hire and fire workers, it's going to provide an incentive for these firms to actually employ workers, to take a gamble, to actually give these workers a chance of gaining skills and reduce the occupational immobility of labour. But if it was geographical immobility of labour that was existing foremost, then we need to find a way to improve immobility in terms of making people move locations. So maybe it's providing grants to workers which gives them an incentive to move to further distances. Maybe it's providing low-cost housing, which incentivizes movement away. But you've got your generic problems with supply-side policies, of which these are. They're very expensive, they have a large opportunity cost, they take a long time to work, there is no guarantee they will work. These kind of generic issues are relevant here with evaluation. But what if there was a lot of frictional unemployment? Frictional unemployment we know is search unemployment. So when workers are between jobs, they're searching for new jobs. In between the time when they actually leave their job and when they find a new job, they are unemployed, they're frictionally unemployed. So to reduce that type of unemployment, you simply have to disincentivize searching for work. So, or make it easier for people to actually find work. So if you reduce unemployment benefit, that disincentivizes people searching. It disincentivizes people leaving jobs without actually having one straight away, having a new one straight away. So reducing unemployment benefits disincentivizes leaving jobs and searching for another one. Or you can improve job information, whereby people that actually are searching can find it easier to find a new job. So that might be improving the quality of job centres, improving the number of vacancies that are out there on the internet or whatever. All the information that can be out there is out there, basically. So improving job information will make it easier for workers to find work and reduce the time it takes for them to search. But again, you've got problems. These are, again, supply-side policies, so problems, no guarantee of them working. There is a big time lag, they take a long time to work, as do these, which is another problem. And they carry large opportunity cost, especially the second one can be very, very costly. So these are all the policies that can be used to reduce unemployment. Again, your evaluation, main thing is it depends on the cause, depends on the type of unemployment. Only then will the government know what policy is needed to reduce unemployment. Thanks very much for watching, see you next time. We all understand that the government has a very important inflation target. So if inflation is getting out of control, what policies do the government have to actually reduce inflation? Well, first of all, it needs to know what type of inflation is being caused, what type of inflation is going out of control. Is it demand pull or is it cost push? Then it can act. If it's demand pull, basically there is too much aggregate demand in the economy. So the government needs to find a way to reduce the level of aggregate demand. The easiest way to do it is to use contractionary policies, contractionary monetary or contractionary fiscal policies. Contractionary fiscal policies involves either increasing taxation or reducing government spending. Contractionary monetary policy involves increasing interest rates, maybe. It might be reducing the money supply or making the exchange rate stronger, all of which will reduce aggregate demand. And that will bring down the level of demand pull inflation. But there are some severe problems with that. Yes, it might actually promote low inflation, but there are conflicts with other macro objectives. By reducing aggregate demand, growth in the economy will fall, unemployment will increase, which are all against the other macroeconomic objectives of government. At the same time, whether these policies will work depends on the initial level of economic activity, it depends on the size of the multiplier, as we've talked before, depends on whether it might be offset by other factors, etc. So all the same depends on points that we've used many times before with these kind of policies applied again. Depends on the level of confidence, consumer confidence as well. But what if there is cost push inflation? Inflation caused by the supply side of the economy, very simply, when there is an increase in the costs of production. Well, if that's what's causing inflation, then the government needs to find a way to reduce costs of production, if it can do. So, let's say that it was a massive increase in wages that has increased cost push inflation, in which case the government maybe could restrict wage rises. That's one way it can keep a lid on the increase in cost of production. But the problem with that is that it might lead to an inflexible labour market. If you don't actually allow wages to increase if people are doing a good job, then you might actually negate how hard workers work. Workers might be fed up, they might not want to be productive and work hard. So the labour market might be very inflexible. It might be hard to recruit the best staff as well, if you can't make your position lucrative by offering higher wages, etc. You might look at another way. You might decide to reduce corporation tax, which again reduces the cost of production for firms. And that's got the added benefit of increasing investment, but you've got your standard supply side issues with that policy. And also the problems that we talked about with fiscal policy apply here. You could subsidise firms, just give out subsidies for whatever reason it might be, to promote R&D, for whatever reasons really. You give out subsidies, that lowers the cost of production for firms. But it might promote inefficiency. If firms just now get subsidies, it might reduce incentives for them to cut waste, because they can rely on the subsidy to actually get them through. So it might promote inefficiency, and that's not good either. At the same time, it's very, very costly, it's not guaranteed to work, etc. All these kind of similar issues as we talked about before. Or, if they're looking to control inflation in the long term, not just in the short term, the government could promote supply-side policies and use those to control inflation in the long term. But your standard supply-side policies problems apply here. So any supply-side policies could be used. You can evaluate whether they're going to work or not in the same way as normal. They're very expensive, they carry very large opportunity costs, they take a long time to work, they may not actually work, and it depends on the initial level of economic activity as well as to whether they're going to reduce inflation or not. So that's how the government can reduce inflation. The main evaluation here is it depends on what type. That's important to know. Then it can target the different policies to be used. Thanks very much. See you next time. So, let's say we now have a government that's trying to deal with a large current account deficit. How can it do that? Well, remember, current account deficits can be caused from a whole host of various factors. So the government needs to first pinpoint the cause of the deficit before it actually knows how to solve the deficit. So let's say the reason for a current account deficit was because there was high demand in the domestic economy, incomes were very high as a result in the domestic economy, and there was a very high demand for imports. Well, if that was the reason why there's a deficit, then maybe the government should try and reduce the level of aggregate demand in the economy, which will reduce the spending on imports. It can do that by imposing contractionary monetary or fiscal policies. So for contractionary fiscal policy, it might want to reduce government spending or increase taxation. Monetary policy, maybe increase interest rates or reduce the money supply, all of which will reduce aggregate demand and therefore reduce the level of import spending in the economy. But the problem with that, anytime we reduce AD, there are big side effects, big problems, in that growth is going to reduce and unemployment is going to increase. Terrible side effects. You're making what many governments would argue more important macroeconomic objectives worse. Is that really a good trade-off? Probably not. Also, whether these policies will work or not depends on a standard. Demand-side policy depends on points. The level of consumer confidence, the initial level of economic activity, the size of the multiplier, whether it's been offset by other factors, etc. By the way, if you want to understand why current account deficits might be caused, watch my previous video on causes of a current account deficit to understand. Let's say that import prices were too low. That's why we were demanding so many imports. Or let's say export prices were too high. In which case the government can actually get in and protect domestic industries. It can artificially raise the price of imports and artificially lower the price of exports by imposing protectionist measures, such as tariffs and quotas, which will raise, or tariffs will raise the price of imports because it's a tax on import. Quotas will restrict the level of imports allowed into the country. There are other protectionist measures as well which can restrict imports. At the same time, they might want to provide subsidies to domestic firms, which lowers their cost of production. It makes exports more competitive, potentially an increase in the level of exports being sold. So these are ways in which a current account deficit can be rectified. But there are some major issues with this idea as well. Retaliation, first of all. If one government decides to protect its domestic industries, chances are other governments won't like it. Other governments are going to retaliate and say, hang on a minute, if you're protecting yourself against us and you're imposing taxes on our products, then we're going to impose taxes on your products. Chances are you're going to see retaliation, which is a big negative, reducing overall trade in the economy. At the same time, if you make imports more expensive by imposing tariffs, firms who rely on imports to make goods and services, well, their cost of production is going to increase, which therefore may lead to increased prices and inflation. So there is a chance of imports and inflation for firms who actually import raw materials if you artificially increase the price of imports. At the same time, by providing subsidies to domestic producers, or just generally, by reducing the level of imports into the economy, you're reducing competition for domestic firms. So domestic firms might become lazy. They might not actually need to reduce their prices and keep their prices high. That's another problem there. So, number one, number two, not the greatest policies because of the massive negative side effect. What about if a strong currency was the reason why there was a current account deficit? In which case the government should look to weaken the currency. Maybe tell the central bank, or somehow allow the central bank to reduce interest rates, Or maybe they can meddle in the foreign exchange markets and sell the currency, causing it to decrease, increasing supply. That will allow WIDEC to work. Remember, WIDEC means with a weak currency, imports become more expensive and exports become cheaper, so the demand for exports will rise, the demand for imports will fall, potentially increasing net exports and reducing the current account deficit. But whether that works or not depends on the PED for imports and exports, as explained on my previous video. It also might lead to import and inflation as imports become more expensive, which is quite a big negative side effect and can again conflict with the inflation objective of government. So then, if that's a slightly dubious policy as well, maybe the best idea is to implement supply-side policies, any supply-side policies which increase the productive capacity of the economy, thus putting downward pressure on prices, reducing cost-push inflationary pressures. And in doing so, exports may become more competitive, which then may increase the demand for exports, and then again reduce the current account deficit problems that a country might be experiencing. But the problems with supply-side policies are, as we know, they're very expensive, they carry a large opportunity cost, they take a long time to work, there's no guarantee that they will work, and for these policies to reduce inflation, to increase the productive capacity, depends initially on the level of economic activity as well. So, these are all the policies available to government. Whatever policy needs to be used depends on the cause, but you might argue regardless that supply-side policies are the best policies. But you can evaluate it in another way. You could actually say, well, hang on a minute. It looks like a current account deficit or trade problems are not so much of an issue for governments. Growth, unemployment and inflation are potentially more important macroeconomic objectives. So if a country's got a current account deficit, but only a very small deficit, then you could argue the government doesn't really need to get involved. All these policies, yeah, they're available, but do they really need to worry about such a small current account deficit as a percentage of GDP? So for example, the UK has had such a small current account deficit, around between 2 and 5% of GDP over the last 20 years. That's not really that big a deal. So that's another very good way to argue. Yes, it depends on the cause of the deficit for the government to actually know how to solve it. But you could argue that maybe the government doesn't need to solve it, especially given the massive side effects of the policies that it could use and the conflicts with other objectives at the same time. So maybe a current account deficit can be allowed to occur if it's a very, very small percentage of GDP. That's policies to improve current account deficit and evaluation. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Hi everybody, a very eagerly anticipated video this one where we go through the key UK economy stats for 2017. It's important in your writing that you constantly are applying to UK context, as long as of course that's what the question will be focusing on. But major examples will require you to have good knowledge of the UK economy, current and past, but especially current, for you to analyse and evaluate your essays with. So knowledge of this is expected, you need to be able to do it well, and quoting these figures will get you top marks in your essays. Let's get started by looking at economic growth. Well, annual growth rate in the UK economy currently stands at 2.1%. We have a negative output gap of 0.35%, so a tiny bit of slack still in the economy. On a Keynesian diagram, we're very close to YFE. On a classical diagram, where AD cuts SRES, is very close to LRS. Only a tiny negative output gap there. So a nice figure for you to quote here. Quarterly growth rate of 0.3%, and crucially, the forecast annual growth rates. Mark Carney has revised down the UK's growth forecast for this year from 2% to 1.9%, as you can see here. That is for 2017, and he blames a spending squeeze that is likely to hit UK households quite hard this year. Well, wages are going to grow at around 2.3%, but inflation is going to be greater than that, peaking at around 2.7 or 2.8%. In real terms, wages are going to be negative, therefore, which is going to hold back consumer spending, hence why he revised down growth expectations and forecasted growth rates for this year from 2% to 1.9% now this year. Going forward, 2018, 1.6%, 2019, 1.7%, 2020, 1.9%, 2021, 2%. Good to know these forecasted annual growth rates, but also to know that these are based on very heavy assumptions. The Bank of England have said, so Mark Carney has said, that these forecasts are based on a smooth negotiation with the European Union over Brexit. You know, if it's not smooth, then what on earth is that going to do to these figures? It might completely throw them out. GDP per capita in real terms stands at £30,000 approximately per head. We've got total GDP of £2 trillion, that is the UK economy's size. And the breakdown of GDP, this is very important. So if we look at the output method, what are we actually producing in the UK economy? Well, 79% of our output, of our GDP, is services. Only 14% is manufactured goods. So we only produce 14% worth of goods in the UK economy. 79% services, very unbalanced UK economy in that sense. Only 6% construction, 1% agriculture. That explains why maybe the weak pound hasn't had the huge impact on exports as we'd expect it to be, because we don't have a very large manufacturing base. If we look at the expenditure method of GDP, worth knowing that consumption represents around 66% of total UK GDP using the expenditure method. Consumption very heavy, government spending is next. Net exports contributes a negative figure to UK GDP. Using the expenditure method, investment is a very small chunk as well. Let's have a look now at unemployment. Well, the unemployment rate currently stands at 4.7%. Full employment is 4.5%. This one is quite disputed. Generally, you'll hear that full employment is around the 5% mark, but 4.5% is a very precise number. And if we have unemployment at 4.7, it tells you that a negative output gap of this kind of size is correct. You know, we're not quite at full employment, very close to it though. Forecasted unemployment is worth knowing too. Expectations are for this figure to rise gently. So by the end of this year, maybe getting to 4.8%, into next year around 4.8%. And I've seen forecasts that by 2020 it's going to rise to 5.1%. So bear that in mind. Who knows, the shock of Brexit might change those forecasts as well. Youth unemployment of 11.9%. It's hard to interpret whether that's a really good number or not so good. If you compare to other Eurozone countries where youth unemployment, you know, can be around 25%, in Greece more around 50%, then this is very good. In France, for example, it's 25%. But there is an issue with this, which is that graduates in this country, good graduates with very strong degrees, are struggling to find graduate jobs. They end up in non-graduate jobs, quite low-skilled jobs. So maybe that is a bit of a concern in certain ways, if you look at it in that sense. Long-term unemployment at 1.3%, that's fine. Remember, long-term unemployment is defined as unemployment lasting for more than a year. Wage growth at 2.3%. It's been 2.3% over the last couple of years, and that's been an excellent figure when inflation has been very low. We had about a deflation around a year and a half ago. So 2.3%, around that, has been fantastic over the last 2 years. But going forward into this year, where inflation is close, well, inflation is exactly that right now, and is going to go beyond that, real wages are going to actually decrease, and that explains why we saw the revision in annual growth for this year by Mark Carney through the Bank of England. So 2.3% is a good stat to know. Consumer confidence. Right, we need to link back to the Brexit vote. Since the Brexit vote, consumer confidence has done some very funny things. Immediately after the vote, consumer confidence took an absolutely massive dive. Huge concerns over what Brexit meant to the UK economy. Fed through into very low consumer confidence, although that didn't last very long. It only lasted for around 3 months. Then we saw a big recovery in consumer confidence, going back to what it was before the Brexit vote. But most recently, it has fallen. Concerns about the weak pound and the impact of that on the UK economy. Concerns about high inflation. Concerns about potential rise in unemployment. Concerns about the uncertainty of a Brexit. Concerns about the uncertainty given the recent, or the current election that's going to happen on June the 8th. So yeah, all of those reasons have explained why over the last couple of months, consumer confidence has decreased. Income tax bands, worth knowing that as well, that for the first £11,500 of your income, you pay absolutely no tax. That's called the income tax-free allowance. Between £11,500 and £45,000, you're taxed at 20% on that income only. And any income earned above £45,000 up to £150,000, you're taxed at 40%. And income earned above £150,000, you're taxed at 45%. So they're the income tax bands. You need to know it's a progressive income tax system in the UK. That covers growth and unemployment. Let's now have a look at inflation and the balance of payments. The current CPI inflation rate is 2.3%. Now that's risen quite dramatically from this time last year, where inflation was less than 1%. So 2.3% is quite a marked rise. Why is that? The weak pound is to blame. Mark Carney said in its entirety, this inflation is coming from the supply side as a result of the falling pound. So you can blame higher oil prices. You can see here, our oil prices have risen from $43 a barrel in 2016, so this time last year, 2016, to $51 a barrel right now as I'm talking. So a slight rise in the oil price there, but bearing in mind that we import oil in dollars, then with a weak pound, that's making the import of oil more expensive, and that's feeding through to higher fuel prices. That's one big contributor. the transport part of the CPI basket has gone up significantly in price, feeding through to higher CPI inflation rates. We've also seen higher food prices. You can see food price inflation. We've also seen general commodity prices rising, gas and electricity prices rising, but also the recreation and culture part of the CPI basket has gone up in price too. And part of that will be because of the weak pound, things like foreign holidays, for example, being more expensive. The forecast with inflation is for it to continue rising later into this year, to peak at around 2.8%. Very good to know that inflation is in the pipeline. We expect more to come with CPI. Food price inflation at that, 1.2%. Core inflation, 1.8%. Core inflation is the CPI inflation rate, but stripping out gas and electricity, stripping out fuel, stripping out food as well. So these items that are very prone to swings in price, very volatile, the prices of these three different items there. So taking those out gives you core inflation. So if ever we feel that the CPI inflation rate is being strongly distorted by either fuel, gas, electricity, or food, or maybe all three of them, then we can look at core inflation to see what the underlying rate of price growth is in the UK economy. And you can see that core inflation is 1.8%. It's pretty close to 2.3%, so pretty close to the CPI inflation rate, but not quite exact. So it tells you that there is some distortion here, coming from fuel price rises in particular in this case. Producer price inflation, a lovely stat to really impress the examiner, standing at 3.6%. Remember, producer price inflation measures the change in the price of a basket of wholesale goods as they leave the factory, also known as factory gate inflation. If this is rising, that is a sign that input prices are rising. For example, oil prices. For example, gas, electricity prices, and other commodity prices, for example. So that reflects what's going on with input prices, and therefore what is likely to happen to CPI, because retailers will often buy from wholesalers, right? So what we buy in the shops, they are retailers, they're retail shops, but they will buy their goods from wholesalers. So if this is what's happening with wholesale goods, then we expect that to feed through to CPI inflation. You can see there is a differentiation, isn't there? There is a strong difference between 3.6 and 2.3, and that explains why forecasts are for CPI inflation to rise to around 2.8% going forward. It doesn't have to match exactly. PPI doesn't have to match exactly to CPI because there is often a time lag, and also because retailers might absorb some of the higher costs instead of passing it on to us via higher prices in its entirety. So we can say that inflation is in the pipeline. We know about oil prices, I mentioned that. House price inflation is worth knowing. We know there is a link between house prices and consumer spending, the wealth effect. Annually, house prices are rising quite considerably by 3.8%. But interestingly, over the last month, there has been house price deflation ranging between 0.1% deflation of houses and 0.4%, depending on the source you take here. But to know that recently house prices have fallen is quite interesting. A cooling off housing market. Inflation expectations stand at 2.9%, important. There might be a link to wage bargaining here, but it's interesting to know that the forecasts are feeding through to expectations. But wage growth is 2.3% and expected to stay at 2.3%. So 2.3% wage growth, yet expected 2.8% CPI, a fall in real wages there, hence the spending squeeze that Mark Carney talked about. Let's now talk about the balance of payments and the UK's trade position. The UK's current account deficit, the most recent figure we have, is 2.4% of GDP, minus indicating a deficit here. You need to know that this has narrowed significantly. Data immediately before that was more around the 5.5% mark. And that tells you just how much it's narrowed. The weak pound is the reason why. We have a large trade deficit in that quarter, the last quarter of 2016. Our trade deficit stood at £12 billion, significant narrowing from before, but still a deficit. Our current account deficit, our trade deficit, is structural. The reason why we have it is because of very poor productivity and very, very poor investment. There are huge weaknesses in the UK economy from the supply side in these two areas. In fact, if we look at productivity, since the financial crisis, we have not gained any productivity. We are back at pre-crisis levels. We are way below trend, considering where we should be with productivity. If we continue the trend from before the financial crisis, we are miles below where we should be with productivity, only just recovering to pre-crisis levels. Terrible. Our investment as well is weak. So these are big weaknesses in the UK economy, the reasons why we have such a deficit, a structural current account deficit here. Our exchange rate is weak. It's recovered somewhat. The pound has gained strength in the last 3 months or so, but it's still weak. To the dollar, we're looking at £1 to $1.29. Before the Brexit vote, it was more like £1 is equal to $1.50, so a significant weakening of the pound there against the dollar. But even against the euro, much more of a recovery against the euro that we've seen recently. £1 now to €1.19. Before the Brexit vote, it was more £1 to €1.30. So it tells you, even with a very weak euro, the pound is even weaker. We haven't regained the lost territory as a result of the Brexit vote. But the weak pound has helped to narrow our current account deficit. We need to know a little bit about our major trading partners and the health of the economies of our major trading partners. The Eurozone and the US economies are our major trading partners, and both are growing quite well. The Eurozone economy is recovering, quite healthy growth forecast of 1.7% this year. The US is essentially at full employment, forecast 2% growth this year as well. So we expect that the weak pound will promote more demand for UK exports from both the Eurozone and the US economy. To an extent, we've seen both. Let's now move on, and we look at government finances. We also look at income inequality and interest rates in the UK economy. The UK's budget deficit currently stands at 3% of GDP. As a raw figure, that's £50 billion worth of borrowing in the fiscal year 2016 to 2017. So April 2016 to April 2017, approximately £50 billion worth of borrowing, a budget deficit being run, and 3% of GDP. It's good to know both percentage of GDP and also the raw figure. Since austerity in 2010, that figure has come down markedly. We were more like 10% of GDP budget deficit in 2010 to now 3%. That's come down dramatically there. The forecast is for the budget deficit to be £20 billion by 2019. Now, crucially, even with austerity, still running budget deficits, still borrowing every single year. And the forecast is to continue borrowing, even up to 2019. No sign of a budget surplus. So Philip Hammond has ditched the idea of running a budget surplus by 2020. That's what George Osborne wanted. So if we look at by 2019 here, still a budget deficit, even into 2020, a budget deficit is expected. So he ditched that pledge. But what he's not ditched is the idea of austerity. So if the Conservatives win the election coming up, there will still be austerity. And the idea is to get to these kind of budget deficit figures going forward. What about debt to GDP? So our national debt figures now, 89.1% debt to GDP ratio when it comes to looking at government debt here. That has not come down since austerity, it's risen. In 2010, it was more like 81% debt to GDP. Why has it gone up? Well, one is that we borrowed, haven't we? Every single year we've run a budget deficit since austerity started in 2010. So we've been increasing our national debt, but also our GDP has not risen by that much, not enough to counter the increase in debt there. Annual rates of GDP have averaged at around 1% just over since austerity. So that's why that figure has actually increased quite markedly since austerity. But the plan is for it to decrease by 2090 because growth rates will increase and budget deficits will be decreasing. However, both these forecasts, guys, are based on quite heavy assumptions, are based on the growth forecasts we mentioned before, which might be totally out. If they're out, tax revenues are not going to be as high as the forecast suggests, and therefore these figures will be way off. They're also based on the idea that there won't be any need for massive fiscal stimulus. But what if there is? What if Brexit, when we actually leave, causes a huge shock to the UK economy and fiscal stimulus is necessary? Then again, these figures will be way out. Bond yields are 1.2%. That's based on the average for 10-year government bonds. That tells you that it's quite cheap for the government to borrow at the moment. Income tax bands, as we mentioned before. Corporation tax and VAT, important that you know both of these. Corporation tax has very recently been cut to 19%. The plan is to reduce this to 17% by 2020. VAT at 20%. There are chances that this could rise, even though Theresa May has come out and said that there will be no rise to national insurance and no rise to VAT if the Conservatives win this general election coming up in June. There is still a chance that this could go up. This figure is much less than the average across Europe, where average VAT rates are more like 25%. So just in case we're in need of an increase in tax revenues, VAT is a natural place to go for that increase to come. What about income inequality? Our Gini coefficient stands at 0.34. Now that has actually come down since austerity. You know, an argument against austerity normally is that it will widen income inequality. Well, we've not seen that. In 2010, our Gini coefficient was 0.36. Now it's 0.34. Remember how to interpret the Gini. The closer the figure is towards zero, the more equal the distribution of income is. So since 2010, we've seen an improvement in the Gini coefficient there. But that doesn't mean it's all hunky-dory. On a relative scale, our income distribution is much more unequal compared to the OECD average, which is at 0.31. Our Gini is higher than that, i.e. more unequal distribution of income. There is an issue here. The government is looking at ways in order to reduce income inequality in the UK. And remember that income inequality is a normative consideration, whether it's good or bad. So the way you look at these figures is totally up to you, or the way in which governments look at those figures is a very normative consideration. Bear that in mind. What about interest rates in the UK economy? Well, the base rate currently is 0.25%. That's the central bank interest rate, cut from 0.5% in August 2016 after the Brexit vote to prevent a recession post the Brexit vote and a shock to the UK economy. So we saw a cut in interest rates from 0.5 to 0.25%. That has fed through to market interest rates. So for example, LIBOR, the London interbank offer rate, the rate at which commercial banks lend and borrow from each other, is 0.34%. And that is the rate which will determine savings rate, mortgage rates, for example. That's a very important interest rate. So for that to be 0.34 tells you that the transmission mechanism of monetary policy feeding through to lower market interest rates is working very strongly. Even average lending rates are 1.25%. That tells you that, yeah, borrowing money is cheap at the moment. The lower interest rates from the central bank are feeding through to the real economy. Average mortgage rates are low too. This is a 2% average for new buyers looking to fix their mortgage rate over 2 years. The average quote that you'll get is 2%. That tells you again it's quite a low rate for new buyers looking to borrow to buy a house. Consumer confidence, we mentioned the recent falls and the reasons why before. Business confidence is very interesting. Since the Brexit vote, business confidence took an absolute dive and it's only recently started to recover somewhat, but still very, very low. Concerns about Brexit and what that will mean for the UK economy, what that will mean for UK businesses, and also concerns about the current election and what's going to happen after that election, especially regarding Brexit. Mortgage approvals have seen recovery since the Brexit vote. QE now stands in total at £435 billion worth of money pumped into the UK economy. That figure increased by 60 billion in August 2016. So in August 2016, the total figure was 375 billion. But with the cut in interest rates, we also saw an extra 60 billion pounds pumped into the UK economy to help prevent a Brexit shock, basically. And that's why we got 435 billion pounds total QE in the UK economy. And that might explain the next stat here, which is the willingness to lend, especially to small and medium enterprises. It's quite funny actually, if you look at the stats since the financial crisis, banks were simply not willing to lend to small and medium enterprises. The amount of lending taking place to these businesses actually kept falling up until 2016. From 2016 onwards, we saw a recovery. You can argue that banks have become less risk averse, their balance sheets have become healthier, more quantitative easing in August 2016 meant that banks were sitting on more cash which they were willing to lend out, even to more risky small and medium firms looking to invest. Some key supply side policies for you now, great to use in your essays. Let's look at policies to encourage long-term investment first. Well, we've got a cut in corporation tax, as we mentioned before, currently standing at 19%, but the pledge is to reduce it at 17% by 2020. The idea is to increase the retained profits that firms make to encourage more investment, thus shifting LRAS, increasing the productive capacity of the economy. Policies to encourage long-term investment. Well, we've got the annual investment allowance of £200,000 to encourage more firms to invest. We've also got subsidies and tax allowances, especially for small and medium enterprises. In fact, only for those companies when they engage in R&D expenditure. So nice for you to talk about those too. You've got policies to promote a more skilled workforce. Well, look at this first one, the idea that the income tax-free allowance has been raised. It's been raised quite significantly, most recently raised from £11,000 to £11,500. There is a pledge to increase that, or plans to increase that, to £12,500 by 2020. The idea of that is twofold. To increase productivity, so those in work receiving a tax cut have got an incentive to work a bit harder. But also, you've got those who are inactive have now got a strong incentive to join the labour force and to search for work, to be an active part of the labour force, increasing the quantity of labour. So both the quality and the quantity of labour to be increased by such a policy. And the idea is also to increase the higher income tax threshold to £50,000. So basically the income that you earn before you start paying the higher rate of tax of 40% here, to be starting at £50,000 instead of currently it being £45,000. There are plans
Why
to
do you
increase
block me, you piece of shit?
which again will give quite a significant tax cut to a proportion of the population. We've also got some more, I guess you would call education and training related policies, interventionist policies here. One example is apprenticeship funding. The Conservative government are very big on funding apprenticeship schemes. Something that you should know is that For those individuals who are aged between 16 and 18 who want to become an apprentice, well, that scheme will be funded entirely by the government. No contribution directly through the individual or directly through the company at all. The government will fund it all. Where does that money come from? It comes from an apprenticeship levy. So indirectly, companies will have to pay, and it's companies who earn more than £3 million worth of profits have to pay an apprenticeship levy, which goes to funding these apprenticeship schemes. You've also got curriculum reform, so think about A-level reform, think about primary school reform. The idea is to boost productivity, to boost outcomes in school, to improve skills and human capital in the workforce, and therefore increase productivity of the labour force over time. You've also got subsidies and grants for adult training, so any adults that want training or to want to gain qualifications, they want to do courses or to get degrees. So these are kind of mature courses here. They're eligible for certain subsidies and certain grants depending on their background, depending on their financial situation. So these are policies specifically designed to improve education, to boost productivity of the labour force. Transportation, so we look at infrastructure, related expenditures here. The government has committed to a new road fund, funded by increases in vehicle excise duty recently. In 2017/2018, the government is committed to £1.2 billion worth of money going to local councils to improve roads, to help reduce traffic and to maintain roads in local areas. There is also a commitment to rail investment, to electrification, for example, making trains move quicker on the rail line, but also to completing projects like Crossrail and HS2. The government is committed to spending on digital infrastructure to make sure that 95% of all households have got access to super-fast Wi-Fi at the end of this year. They've also committed to spending £6.9 billion in UK's research infrastructure to help promote more R&D. If we look at policies here, a lot of these were interventionist policies, a few market-based policies. These are more market-based policies, free market policies. Let's understand what they are. So planning reform, the UK government is committed to ease planning permission, especially for new housing to be built. So on brownfield sites, for example, to ease the planning permission, to allow building companies to make houses on those areas, on that kind of land. The Conservative Party regularly talk about a higher pay, lower tax and lower welfare UK society, UK economy. And one way in which they want to achieve that is by capping any working benefits. So benefits that can be claimed whilst working, caps on those to ensure that welfare is low where it's not maybe necessary, but also to increase the national minimum wage. And this one's quite interventionist, isn't it? To increase the national minimum wage and also to increase the national living wage. The idea there to encourage more people into work, to make sure that there is a fair wage being paid by those who are actually working as well. The idea of a higher pay society as a result. They want to encourage competitive markets. Great stat for you to know. By cutting £10 billion of red tape, that is deregulation, cutting excess regulation, up to £10 million worth of deregulation there. They also want to encourage more trade. They haven't specified how exactly, but they've specified that, yeah, we want more trade, more exports, to rebalance the UK economy in this sense, to develop stronger links with emerging economies in particular, and with generally countries outside the EU post-Brexit, to develop strong links with those countries, and to try and export into those economies there, and rebalance, diversify the UK economy. In general, to rebalance the economy, this Northern Powerhouse idea started with George Osborne. It's not been ditched, it's still there to an extent, although Theresa May doesn't talk about it as much as George Osborne did. But it's still there, the idea of rebalancing away from a London dependency in the UK towards, northern councils having more power over how to bring more business to cities up north, how to regenerate cities up north, how to make sure there are strong jobs up north, high-paying jobs up north, to make sure that transportation and infrastructure is strong up north as well. So the devolution of powers, as opposed to being fully controlled by central government, to actually giving more powers to local councils up north to create this northern powerhouse and less of a London dependency. So that covers all the UK stats that you need for your exam, all correct as of when I made this video in 2017. Do make sure that you've written all this down, you're aware of it, as well as these key supply side policies you can use. Now you can go out there and smash in your exam and hit the top marks. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you all next time. Hi everybody, what a huge video this is, looking at examples for everything in the macroeconomics course to help you smash your essay writing and get the highest possible marks. Your examiner will expect you to apply for every bit of theory that you're writing in your essay, not just to the UK economy. Yes, that will be a predominant focus for you, but using examples outside the UK as well will be fantastic in your examinations. Let's get going straight away. by looking at all the determinants of aggregate demand and applying to those. Let's start with determinants of consumption and look at countries that have got low interest rates. You've got the UK having just cut interest rates at 0.25%, the Eurozone at 0%, Japan's interest rate is in negative territory. The idea is to encourage more borrowing and consumption, also to lower mortgage repayments for those on variable rate mortgages and tracker rate mortgages and boost consumption that way. Countries with high interest rates shifting 80 left with less consumption. South Africa, Russia, Brazil, all three countries have recently cut their interest rate, but the general interest rates are very high, so good to use still. Countries with high house prices are therefore a positive wealth effect, the UK and the USA. In the UK, recently house prices have cooled off a bit, falling in some areas, but generally over the last 3, 4, 5 years, the trend of house prices has been very strongly positive. Very high general house prices in the UK, feeding through to a very strong wealth effect and higher consumer spending in that regard. Negative wealth effect, China, with the stock market crash hitting consumer spending very hard and consumer confidence as well. Countries with a high level of real disposable income, we're looking at the UK, the USA and Australia. In the USA especially, disposable income levels very high with strong wage growth, much greater than inflation in the US. So the link between real disposable income and consumption is very strong there. What about countries with low real disposable income? The Eurozone, China, recent slowdown in China, slow growth rates. Brazil, Russia, Argentina, countries all in recession as we speak right now. Good to use that in your essay. Countries with low income tax, stick to the UK. You know about how income tax has been cut in this country, not directly, through an increase in the tax-free allowance and through higher income tax bands, but good to use really. The UK is your base country to go to for low income taxes. Countries with high consumer confidence, you can talk about the USA, Australia and the UK. Not recently in the UK, but a trend over the last 2 years has been higher UK consumer confidence, so make sure you talk about it in that way. But these two countries with quite strong consumer confidence, vice versa, low consumer confidence. UK, as I said recently, many concerns at the moment in the UK economy is hitting consumer confidence right now quite hard. Russia, Brazil, Eurozone, these two countries in deep recession, hitting consumer confidence with high unemployment rates. But also in the Eurozone, link that to high unemployment rates across the Eurozone, especially very high youth unemployment rates, meaning that consumer confidence is staying quite low right now. What about determinants of investment? Well, you've got interest rates, as number 1 and number 2 suggest. We know that interest rates will affect investment too, so use these two examples here as your determinants of investment as well. High business confidence, the USA and Australia, good to use there. Low business confidence, the UK. Recently, UK business confidence has taken a tumble, really since the Brexit vote actually. UK business confidence has taken a dive and has never recovered. China, Brazil, Russia, low corporation taxes, the UK and Ireland. UK corporation tax right now is 19%. Plans for it to come down to 17% if the Conservative Party win the election. Ireland, the lowest rate of corporation tax is 12.5% in Ireland, so good 2 examples for you to use. Whereas higher rates of corporation tax go to the USA. The highest rate gets to 35% in the USA. Donald Trump has pledged he's going to cut that to 17%, but right now it stands at 35% for the most profit-making companies. What about government spending? Well, let's look at countries where there is fiscal expansion taking place. China, Japan, Hong Kong, big increases in government spending, generally on infrastructure. The USA, through Donald Trump, has got planned fiscal expansion, good to use that too. Austerity, so this is cuts to government spending. The UK, Spain, Greece, Italy, France, Portugal, you can research these in more detail if you want to have a greater depth of knowledge when it comes to fiscal expansion and austerity policies, and that goes with everything that I'm going to cover in this video as well, guys. If you want to know more detail, it's so easy just to research these examples and to get a greater level of detail to help you in your exam. Very easy just to search for this in Google and get exactly what you need here. But good examples of austerity. Then I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail when we look at fiscal policy later in this video. What about net exports? Well, we know a key determinant of net exports is the exchange rate. Where do we have countries that have got weak exchange rates? Well, Eurozone with a weak euro, Brazil a weak real, the UK with a weak pound, Russia a weak ruble, China with a weak yuan, although this has been managed, forceful, and lowering of the yuan through selling of Chinese currency reserves and also lowering of Chinese interest rates. a very weak South African rand. And you know, in theory, that this will make exports cheaper, imports dearer, and we get a positive current account position as a result. Positive trade position, which will feed through to X minus M being positive, and AD shifting to the right in theory, yes? Vice versa, well, we have strong exchange rates. Right now, the US dollar is very strong against most currencies, the Australian dollar is strong against most currencies, and the yen strong against certain currencies too, going against the opposite to what a weak exchange rate will do, shifting AD left, as X minus M in theory reduces or becomes negative in the AD equation. Let's now move on and look at determinants of SRS and also causes of recession. Determinants of SRS, so plenty of examples of commodity prices being high at the moment. Oil prices increasing, gas, electricity prices increasing, food prices increasing, fertilizers increasing in price, metal prices going up, all of which will shift SRS to the left because of an increase in commodity prices. What about higher sales taxes? That will also shift SRS left. Well, the UK raising VAT in 2010, Japan increasing their sales tax in 2014, all are good examples for you. Weak exchange rate, we know that weak exchange rates will make import prices more expensive and thus will increase costs of production for firms who need to import raw materials and commodities. Where are we seeing weak exchange rates? Well, the pound exchange rate, real, that's Brazil, ruble, Russia, rand, South Africa, lira, Turkey, the naira, that's Nigeria's currency, the euro, eurozone. All countries are seeing some inflation as a result of their weak exchange rates. In some countries it's much more extravagant than others, and you can research that. So these are all examples of SRS shifting left, and you using these to back that up. For SRS shifting right, you just need to find opposite examples for you there. What about causes of recession? Let's look at financial or banking crisis. Which countries have suffered that and has led to a recession as a result? Well, the USA, of course, the UK, this is all in 2008, 2009. The Eurozone as well. Which countries in particular have suffered and are still suffering? Spain, Italy, Greece, major banking issues in all three countries. Still a banking crisis in those countries, which is why Italy and Greece, for example, are still in deep recession. Spain is only just recovering from that recession. Increased interest rates leading to recession. You've got Russia, this is a few years back now, and we're talking 2014 territory. South Africa as well, go back a year or so when interest rates were raised to try and control inflation, but the side effect was a recession. Housing market crash in the UK and the US back to 2008 there. Any oil shocks or high commodity prices stick to the UK here. The UK in 2009 and 2012 we had deep recession. We also had a very high level of inflation, inflation peaking at greater than 5% in both time periods here. Weak exchange rate, as we've just said, right, leading to a recession as SRS shifts left. So a negative supply side shock here, as is that, would be South Africa, Russia, Brazil, Turkey, Nigeria, as we've already mentioned. But these are countries that have gone into recession as a result of this supply side shock with more expensive import prices, leading to SRS shifting left and an actual recession being caused as a result. Higher sales tax, well, Japan in 2014, it led to quite a big recession in Japan as a result. Always good to have examples of countries that are experiencing stagflation. Chances are in your essay somewhere you'll talk about stagflation. If you can apply it to various countries who are actually experiencing it, it's going to look amazing and will really impress your examiner. So South Africa, Brazil, Russia, Venezuela, Argentina, Turkey, Nigeria. If you look at any of these countries right now, you'll see high rates of inflation and very low rates of economic growth. In some instances, negative rates of economic growth, recession and high inflation. Terrible. That is stagflation. Outside the UK, you can use the UK in 2009 and 2012, where inflation was way beyond target and growth rates are very low. But I said a question mark because who knows going forward, the UK might experience stagflation if inflation continues to creep up way beyond target and we see lower growth rates that might occur in the future. Hence I said a question mark. Could the UK experience stagflation in the future? Bear this in mind. Let's move on now, guys, and look at the macro objectives. If you want to apply the benefits of growth, go to these four countries: China, India, Botswana, Lesotho. All the benefits of growth that you know, so higher incomes, tax revenues, profits, etc., can be applied to all four countries. Costs of growth, major costs like higher inflation rates, income inequality, environmental issues, you can apply to these countries. China and India for environmental issues and big income inequality issues. Nigeria and Angola for income inequality, corrupt government issues, you can apply there. Demand pull inflation, we'll go back to China and India, where they were booming as economies, growth rates in double digits. inflation was a side effect, so the early 2000s for both countries. But more recently, the USA, seeing demand pull inflation as their economy reaches full employment. Cost push inflation, many examples of this. Brazil, Russia, as a result of their weak exchange rates. Japan, because of the increase in the sales tax in 2014, that got them some cost push inflation. The UK, as a result of our weak pound, but also because of higher oil prices and commodity prices. South Africa, with their weak exchange rate. Argentina, the US as well. The US with higher clothing prices, food prices, tobacco prices. It's all cost push inflation as well in the US as demand pull inflation. If you're looking for costs of inflation and you want to apply in your essays, go to Argentina, wage spirals, also consumer price spirals as consumers bring forward their expenditure. So Argentina are in a wage price spiral, inflation spiral. When I taught the cost of inflation this time last year, the Argentinian inflation rate was around 20%. Now it's over 40%. Amazing to use, right? If you're talking about cost of inflation and you're worried about spirals, the major consequence of inflation is spiral. Bring in Argentina, your examiner will have a huge smile on their face. So impressive. The UK, cost of inflation, lower purchasing power, squeeze on incomes. Russia and Brazil, the same kind of arguments there as well. Cyclical unemployment, if you want to talk about examples where we've seen that. The Eurozone. Specific economies in the Eurozone, Greece and Italy, still in recession, very high unemployment rates. Same argument for Brazil. In a recession, very high unemployment rates right now in Brazil. Structural unemployment, go to Eurozone, go to India, go to the UK. In the UK, we can link it back to education and graduates ending up in very poor kind of jobs or not finding jobs at all. Structural unemployment, not being educated to where there are vacancies in the economy. The same idea in India, absolutely. In the Eurozone, you can argue hysteresis, cyclical unemployment becoming structural because a lot of it has been long-term unemployment and a lot of de-skilling in the Eurozone as a result. If we just skip back to inflation quickly and focus on negative inflation, i.e. deflation. So countries where there has been examples of good deflation, supply-side deflation, non-permanent deflation. The UK, the USA, the Eurozone, Switzerland. This was all going back to 2015 and early 2016, where we saw good deflation in all these countries, very low levels of deflation from the supply side. Very good to use if a deflation question comes up. But for bad deflation, of course, you go to Japan, who've been suffering with bad deflation since the 1990s and have not got out of it basically for the last 30 years. A great example for you there. Let's go back to unemployment, real wage unemployment linking to minimum wages being set above equilibrium and maybe strong trade unions. The UK and Germany. The UK worries about the living wage. If the living wage is implemented at £8.45 outside of London per hour, £9.75 in London per hour. Big concerns about unemployment. Germany have just implemented a minimum wage a couple of years ago. Concerns about that causing unemployment as well. If we're looking at costs of unemployment, go to the Eurozone. So many examples where you can apply all your costs of unemployment to. Greece, Italy, Spain. Don't need to go into more detail there. Do your research. Pretty much every cost of unemployment you can link to those three countries. For income inequality, i.e. countries with a high Gini coefficient, Nigeria, Angola, South Africa, the USA. These three, we're looking at Gini coefficients beyond 0.6. Go and do your research to get the exact figure. What about countries with a low Gini coefficient, so a relatively equal distribution of income? Norway, Denmark, Sweden. In fact, all your Scandinavian countries should be your go-to place if you want to apply to a relatively equal distribution of income. Countries of absolute poverty, your African nations, China and India still, with relatively high absolute poverty rates. Relative poverty, the USA and the UK, because of quite poor Gini coefficients, so unequal distributions of income, especially in the USA. Very unequal distribution of income, considering what you might expect there. And then policies to redistribute income. I know some examples, this is in the macro course. So for policies, progressive income taxation, right? That's a key policy. Talk about France and their millionaires tax, what a disaster that was. But also look at, the UK's progressive income tax system. Think about what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do if he's elected. By the time you're watching this video, you'll know the result. But you can still talk about what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do with taxation policies in the UK and make the progressive income tax system in the UK much more progressive. UK transfer payments you can use as examples there, especially working benefits and top up to incomes as welfare payments there to help reduce the income gap in the UK. The UK living wage, You can talk about the minimum wage generally, which currently is £7.50 per hour, but you can talk about the intentions of both parties to try and get the minimum wage to equal the living wage, £8.45 per hour outside of London, £9.75 per hour within London. A good policy to use there, and the Germany minimum wage. And then we've got government spending on education and health. Just stick to UK examples there, as we've mentioned many times before. So really, when it comes to policies to redistribute income, just go UK heavy, and it'll be absolutely fine there. Let's now move on and look at macro policy. Let's look at expansionary monetary policy in the form of lower interest rates. Which countries have cut their central bank interest rate? The UK recently, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, China, Eurozone, New Zealand, Australia. This has all happened within the last year and a half. So you can research these in more detail if you want, but for all countries, the basic idea was to boost aggregate demand for some reason. For some countries to increase growth and to reduce unemployment, for some countries to try and boost inflation at times when inflation was actually much lower than target. So you can research the intentions behind them, but these are all countries that have lowered interest rates, expansionary monetary policy in the last year and a half or so. If we want to look at a contractionary monetary policy in the form of higher interest rates, the USA, South Africa, Nigeria, Russia, Brazil, I know some of these are a bit contradictory, but remember, we're talking in the last year and a half or so. So some of these countries, like Russia and Brazil, for example, they raised interest rates, this is about a year or so ago, raising rates to try and bring inflation rates down. But more recently, as inflation has come down, they've cut rates. So that's why you've got Russia and Brazil as examples of both low and high interest rates here. The USA is very interesting, very recent increases in interest rates to try and control inflation rates. The first example of a country recently, developed country, big country that's expanding and doing quite well, raising rates to try and control inflation rates. Will the UK follow? We have to wait and see what happens with inflation. Examples of quantitative easing, so expansionary monetary policy here, boost to the money supply. The US, the UK, Japan and Eurozone. Japan have been using it a lot over the last 15 years. The USA, UK and the Eurozone used it as a response to the financial crisis, 2008-2009. The USA was first in, UK soon after. The Eurozone, very recent actually, just 2 years ago, they started to use quantitative easing. Countries with negative interest rates, so this is hyper-extreme expansionary monetary policy. You guys need to know that the negative interest rate is simply from central bank lending out to commercial banks. It's only that interest rate which is negative, not high street interest rates. So negative interest rates, just the rate at which commercial banks will borrow from the central bank, only that rate is negative. So don't go in your exam and say that, in countries like Sweden or in Japan, the high street interest rates are negative. That's not true. It's just the central bank interest rate which is negative. So Eurozone, Japan, Denmark, Sweden and Switzerland. Good to have examples of that. Well, what about fiscal policy? Well, if we look at countries where we've seen fiscal expansion, i.e. a big increase in government spending, you can go to both Japan and China trying to boost their economies through government spending. A lot of spending on infrastructure in both Japan and China. You can research in more detail exactly where that spending is directed, but big stimulus bills in those two countries. In the USA, you can go to Obama in 2008. His response to deep recession in the US post-financial crisis was to spend a huge amount of money in the economy, the Obama fiscal stimulus there. But you can also talk about proposed fiscal stimulus by Donald Trump as your example of fiscal expansion there as well. What about flip side, austerity, contractionary fiscal policy here? The UK, Ireland, Greece, Spain, Portugal, France and Italy. Combinations of spending cuts and also tax rises. You should do your own research to look at how each individual country has used austerity. So for example, Spain and Portugal has simply relied on the automatic stabilizers. No expansionary fiscal policy beyond that. So that was their version of austerity. The UK government has focused very heavily on government spending cuts, but not tax rises. They've actually cut taxes. So good to know that as well. Ireland have actually recently cut the idea of austerity because austerity was very successful in Ireland, running up large budget surpluses. They're talking actually about government spending plans going forward and expansionary fiscal policy as a result of their successful austerity. Whereas in Greece, France and Italy, there have been big spending cuts and tax rises in those countries. Very unsuccessful austerity policies in those three countries, you can argue. So good to have specific research done about austerity in these different countries. Tax cuts, so we look at expansionary fiscal policy on the other side, not just government spending increases, but cuts to taxation. Go to the UK economy, your best place to go really. You know about income tax cuts in the UK, you know about corporation tax cuts in the UK. With income tax, we're talking about increasing the tax-free allowance and how that has significantly raised since 2010.